Hello, my fellow story seekers. Welcome to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep. And I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. It was the spring of 2019, a season when everything felt calm and predictable. The weather was warming up, and the days stretched just long enough to make evenings feel like an invitation to relax. I had just moved to a small, sleepy town in the Midwest. Not much happened there, and to be honest, that's exactly what I needed. Life had thrown a few curveballs my way, too much stress, too much noise, and I wanted a break. My new apartment was on the third floor of a modest building, the kind with thin walls and a quirky landlord who always seemed to be fixing something. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. It had a creaky floor, outdated cabinets, and a view of the old clock tower in the center of town. I lived alone, though I had my fair share of company in the form of phone calls, text messages, and the occasional video chat with my family and friends. My sister, Lauren, was the one who always checked in the most. We were close, and her texts ranged from funny memes to just making sure you're alive messages. Life had a comforting rhythm. I'd wake up, grab a coffee from the cafe down the street, and work remotely from my laptop. My evenings were quiet. I'd often binge a show, just scroll mindlessly on my phone until I fell asleep. It wasn't an extraordinary life, but it felt safe. My routine rarely changed, and that's why what happened felt so jarring. I remember the details of that week with crystal clarity because everything had felt so ordinary until it wasn't. The week started like any other. Monday was spent catching up on emails, and I rewarded myself with takeout from the Thai place a few blocks away. Tuesday brought a surprise thunderstorm, and I curled up on the couch with a blanket and a book. By Wednesday, I was starting to feel a little restless, so I went for a late-night walk. The streets were quiet, illuminated by the occasional street lamp, and the air carried that damp, earthy smell of recent rain. I always took my phone with me, partly for safety, partly for music, but that night, I let it stay in my pocket. I wanted to soak in the stillness, to feel disconnected from everything for just a moment. When I got back home, I plugged in my phone, brushed my teeth, and climbed into bed. That's when I noticed the faintest noise or vibration. It wasn't unusual for my phone to buzz with late-night notifications. But this time, it was different. It wasn't a notification. It was a call. At first, I didn't think much of it. I reached over, ready to let it go to voicemail, but then my eyes caught something odd. The screen displayed a familiar number, my own. The first time I saw my own number on my phone screen, I stared at it for a moment, thinking I must be mistaken. I blinked a few times, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. There it was, my name and number, as if I were calling myself. For a second, I thought it was some kind of prank, or maybe a telemarketer using a spoofed number. That happens, right? Scammers do it all the time. Still, seeing my own number displayed so boldly on the screen felt wrong. I let it ring, expecting it to stop after a few seconds. It didn't. The phone kept vibrating on the bedside table, an insistent buzz that seemed louder in the stillness of my room. After about 10 rings, it finally stopped. I exhaled, not even realizing I'd been holding my breath, and put the phone back down. But just as I was settling into bed, it buzzed again. This time, I grabbed the phone quickly, half annoyed, half uneasy. Again, it was my number calling. My thumb hovered over the green button to answer, but something in me hesitated. What would I even say? Who or what could possibly be on the other end of the line? I didn't pick up. Instead, I turned the phone face down, hoping the darkness would help me forget the bizarre moment. Eventually, I fell asleep, convincing myself it was nothing, a technical glitch or a weird coincidence. But the next morning, as I scrolled through my call log, there it was. 2 missed calls from my own number, timestamped just before midnight. I told myself it was no big deal. I mean, there had to be an explanation, right? Maybe someone hacked into a system somewhere, or maybe it was one of those annoying robocalls. It didn't help that I worked in tech support and knew how easy it was to spoof numbers. I even Googled it. Phone calling from own number. The results were full of people asking the same question and receiving similar answers. Scammers, spoofing, harmless glitches. Harmless. That's the word I clung to. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasiness. The rest of the day felt off. My mind kept wandering back to the calls. I texted Lauren to tell her about it, hoping she'd offer some kind of reassurance. Creepy, she replied, but prob's just spam. Don't answer next time. That was enough to put my mind at ease. For a while, at least. That evening, I stuck to my routine. I made a quick dinner, watched a couple of episodes of my favorite show, and started getting ready for bed. By the time I climbed under the covers, I'd almost forgotten about the previous night's calls. I turned off the lights and lay there, scrolling through my phone. It was comforting in a way to distract myself with memes and videos. But just as I was about to put the phone down, the screen lit up again. It was my number. This time, the vibration seemed to echo in the quiet room, and I felt a cold chill run through me. My hand shook slightly as I reached for the phone. The thought of ignoring it again made my stomach churn. What if it wasn't just a glitch? I swallowed hard and slid my thumb over the green button. Hello. My voice came out quieter than I intended, barely a whisper. For a moment, there was nothing, just silence. I strained to hear anything, any background noise, any sign of a person on the other end. And then I heard it. Breathing. It wasn't loud or labored, just soft and rhythmic, like someone standing close enough to be heard, but not close enough to speak. Who is this? I managed to say, my voice trembling. The breathing stopped, replaced by a faint crackle, as if the line had gone bad. And then, just before the call ended, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was my voice. Hello. The word came out exactly as I had just spoken it, the same tone, the same hesitation. The call disconnected before I could say anything else. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the screen, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. I replayed the moment over and over in my head, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it, that it was a trick of the mind or some kind of technical error. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the sound of my own voice coming back to me. I spent the next hour pacing around my apartment, my phone clutched tightly in my hand. I thought about calling Lauren, but it was late, and I didn't want to worry her. Instead, I opened my laptop and started researching again, looking for any explanation that might make sense. Most of what I found was the same as before: scam calls, spoofing, harmless pranks. But nothing explained the voice, my voice. I searched forums and message boards, scrolling through posts from people who'd experienced similar things. A few mentioned hearing their own voice, but their stories were vague, and none of them offered any answers. By the time the sun started to rise, I was exhausted, but no closer to understanding what had happened. I told myself it didn't matter. Maybe it was just some freak glitch, a one-time thing. I went about my day as usual, forcing myself to focus on work and not let my imagination get the best of me. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't help but glance at my phone every few minutes, half expecting it to ring again. And then it did. The ringing started to feel inevitable, like an unspoken promise the night would never leave unfulfilled. Every time I saw my own number flash on the screen, the chill in my chest deepened. At first, I tried to maintain my routine, to push through the days as though nothing had changed. But the calls became more frequent and far more disturbing. The next night, I sat on my couch, staring at my phone, half daring it to ring. The TV played softly in the background, but I wasn't paying attention. My eyes darted from the clock to the darkened corners of my apartment, ears straining for every creak of the floorboards or groan of the old pipes. It rang at exactly 11:23 p.m. My number. This time, I didn't pick up. I couldn't. My thumb hovered over the answer button for a heartbeat too long, and the call went to voicemail. I was relieved until the notification popped up. With trembling hands, I played the message. "Hello?" It was my voice again, repeating the same hesitant greeting I'd spoken during the first call. Then came a pause, followed by the sound of faint breathing. But this time, it didn't stop there. A soft, almost inaudible whisper bled through the static. I strained to make out the words, but they were too muffled, too garbled. All I could discern was the tone low, deliberate, and eerily familiar. By the time the message ended, I was drenched in sweat. I replayed it over and over, trying to decipher the whisper. I even held the phone up to my ear, closing my eyes to focus. It wasn't until I heard my own voice this time, right behind me, that I dropped the phone. "Who is this?" The words were identical to the ones I'd spoken into the phone the night before, but they weren't coming from the voicemail. They were coming from the empty room behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. The room was empty. The door was locked, but the air felt heavy, oppressive, like the weight of a presence I couldn't see. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called Lauren. I hadn't told her everything before, but now I needed to. Wait, slow down," she said, her voice steady but concerned. "You're saying you're getting calls from your own number, and you're hearing your own voice?" "Yes," I said, pacing the length of my living room. "And last night, I swear I heard it in my apartment." Lauren paused. "Okay, listen. It's probably just a prank. You know how people can mess with technology these days. Maybe someone hacked your phone. Have you checked your settings?" Her suggestion gave me something to cling to, an explanation rooted in logic. After we hung up, I spent hours going through my phone settings, changing passwords, updating software. I even called my service provider to report the issue. The representative on the other end was polite but unhelpful. "It's probably number spoofing," they said. "We recommend not answering any calls from your own number." I wanted to believe them, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a scam. That night, the calls came again. This time, there were 3, each spaced exactly 10 minutes apart. I didn't answer any of them, but I couldn't bring myself to delete the voicemails. They were shorter now, just the sound of breathing and faint whispers. And then, on the 4th voicemail, the whisper became clearer. "Come home," it said. It wasn't just my voice, it was my voice as a child. The memory hit me like a wave. "Come home" was something I used to say to my dad when he worked late. I'd leave voicemails on his old answering machine, my small voice cracking with impatience and longing. How could anyone know that? I spent the next day digging through old photo albums, letters, and journals, anything that might help me make sense of what was happening. I even called my mom, though I didn't tell her the full story. "Do you remember those voicemails I used to leave for Dad?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Oh, sure," she said, laughing softly. "You were so insistent. Come home, Daddy." It was adorable. Her laughter made me feel sick. I didn't tell her about the calls, the whispers, or the growing sense that this wasn't just about my phone. That night, I tried to stay awake, determined not to let the calls shake me any further. I kept every light in the apartment on, the TV blaring in the background as I scrolled aimlessly on my laptop. But just past midnight, the lights flickered. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The flickering stopped, but the apartment felt different, like the shadows had deepened and stretched in ways they shouldn't. And then my phone buzzed again. I didn't answer. Instead, I stared at it, willing it to stop. The buzzing grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like the sound was coming from inside my own head. When it finally stopped, I checked the screen. There was no missed call, no voicemail, just a single text message. It was from my number. Come home. The text sent a jolt of panic through me, but it was the timestamp that truly unnerved me. 11:23 p.m., the exact time the first call had come days earlier. I scrambled to check my phone settings again, trying to convince myself this was all some elaborate prank. But the phone's data showed nothing unusual, no evidence of a hacked account, no forwarded calls, no signs of spoofing. My apartment, once a sanctuary of calm and routine, now felt alien. The air was heavy, the corners darker than they had any right to be. Every creak of the floor, every hum of the fridge, every distant car horn felt magnified, sinister. And then, for the first time since the calls began, I felt it. A presence. It wasn't something I could see or hear, but I knew it was there. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and my skin prickled with the unmistakable feeling of being watched. Desperate, I called Lauren again. "You need to get out of there," she said, her voice firm. "Pack a bag, come stay with me for a while. Just don't stay there alone." Her offer was tempting, but something held me back. It wasn't just fear, it was curiosity. I needed to know what was happening, why this was happening. I decided to stay. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, phone in hand, waiting. Midnight came and went, and for a brief moment, I thought the calls had stopped. And then, at 12:07 a.m., my phone rang. It wasn't my number this time. It was private, untraceable. With trembling hands, I answered. "Hello?" I whispered. The line was silent for a moment, and then, in a voice that was unmistakably mine, I heard the words, "You shouldn't have stayed." The phone slipped from my hand and landed on the floor with a dull thud. My breath hitched, chest tightening as if the air had turned to lead. My own voice echoed in my head, chilling and definitive. "You shouldn't have stayed." I sat frozen for a moment, staring at the phone where it lay, the screen still glowing faintly in the darkness. The sound of my blood rushing through my ears nearly drowned out the oppressive silence that followed. Nearly, but not entirely. Because then, I heard it. Footsteps. Not outside in the hallway or from the neighbors above me, but inside. Right behind me. I didn't dare turn around. My rational mind screamed that it was impossible. My apartment was locked, every window closed and latched. But my instincts told me otherwise. The sound was deliberate, unhurried. Soft soles against hardwood, moving closer with each step. I forced myself to breathe, to think. My phone was still on the floor, but I couldn't bring myself to reach for it. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if any sudden movement would invite whatever was behind me to strike. The footsteps stopped just behind my chair. "Why?" a voice whispered. It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made my skin crawl. It was my voice again, but distorted lower, raspier, and filled with an emotion I couldn't place. Anger? Sadness? Desperation? I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the edge of the table so tightly my knuckles turned white. "Why did you leave?" the voice said. I couldn't take it anymore. I shot up from my chair, spinning around, ready to confront whoever or whatever was there. but the room was empty. The relief was short-lived. As I stood there, heart hammering in my chest, the lights flickered again. This time, they didn't come back on. In the sudden darkness, the shadows seemed to press in around me, thick and suffocating. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to cut through the gloom. The beam of light was weak, barely illuminating more than a few feet in front of me. That's when I saw it. A figure standing in the doorway to my bedroom. It was tall and vaguely human-shaped, but its features were obscured, as if it were made of the same darkness that filled the room. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unrelenting. "Come home," it said, the words slow and deliberate. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the rug. My phone slipped from my hand again, the light extinguished as it hit the floor. I was plunged into complete darkness. I ran. Blindly, fumbling through the dark, I bolted for the front door. My fingers found the deadbolt, twisting it frantically, but it wouldn't budge. The door felt as if it had fused with the frame, immovable. Behind me, I heard the voice again, closer this time. "You can't run from yourself." I spun around, pressing my back against the door. My eyes had adjusted slightly to the darkness, and I could just make out the shape of the figure, now only a few feet away. It didn't move like a person. It glided, almost imperceptibly, as if it were part of the shadows themselves. "Stop!" I screamed, the word bursting out of me in a mix of fear and anger. "What do you want from me?" The figure tilted its head, as if considering the question. And then, in a voice that was undeniably mine, it said, "I want you to remember." The words hit me like a freight train. Images flashed through my mind, unbidden and overwhelming. My childhood home. My dad's voice, calling me in for dinner. The sound of my own voice, small and pleading. "Come home, Daddy." I hadn't thought about those days in years, hadn't wanted to. They were memories I'd buried, locked away so deeply I'd almost convinced myself they didn't exist. But now they came flooding back, vivid and relentless. I saw myself as a child, sitting by the window, waiting for my dad to come home from work. I remembered the nights he didn't show up, the way my mom would avoid my questions, her face tight with worry. And then, the day he never came back at all. The figure took another step closer, and I felt an unbearable weight settle over me, pressing me down like gravity had doubled. "You left me," it said, its voice heavy with accusation. And then I understood. This wasn't just a random haunting. This wasn't a ghost or a demon or some malevolent force. This was me. The guilt, the grief, the unresolved pain of losing my father, it had festered, grown into something dark and monstrous. It had been waiting, lurking in the corners of my mind, and now it had taken form. "I didn't mean to," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I didn't know how to fix it." The figure stopped, its head tilting again as if scrutinizing me. The oppressive weight lifted slightly, enough for me to breathe again. "You ran away," it said, its voice softer now. "I didn't know what else to do," I said, my voice breaking. I was scared. I didn't know how to face it. For a moment, the room was silent. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. And then, slowly, it began to dissolve, the darkness that made up its form dissipating into the shadows around it. As the figure faded, so did the oppressive feeling that had filled the apartment. The lights flickered back on, and I found myself alone in the quiet stillness of my home. My phone buzzed on the floor, the screen lighting up with a single notification. Voicemail received. I hesitated for a long moment before picking it up. With trembling fingers, I played the message. "Come home," the voice said, soft and almost tender this time. It was the last call I ever received from my own number. The silence that filled the room after the figure dissipated was deafening. For a long time, I stood motionless, my mind struggling to process everything that had just happened. My breath was ragged, my body trembling as I slowly sank back to the floor, hands shaking. I had been sure that the nightmare was over, that whatever had been haunting me had finally been put to rest. But as the minutes dragged on, I realized it wasn't that simple. There was still something wrong, something unresolved. I picked up my phone, the weight of it in my hands feeling heavier than ever. The voicemail still sat there, waiting for me. I didn't know why I hesitated to listen again. Maybe I was afraid of hearing that voice once more. Maybe I didn't want to face what it meant, what it had all meant. But I pressed play anyway, my thumb moving almost involuntarily. The voice, my voice, crackled over the speaker, softer now, but still unmistakable. Come home. I turned the phone off, placing it down gently on the table, as if it might shatter if I were too rough. I was still trying to make sense of it, all the voice, the figure, the memories flooding back. I couldn't stay in that apartment anymore. It felt wrong, like the very walls were watching me, waiting for me to slip up. The air had become thick, suffocating with everything I had tried to bury. The truth was, I had been running from something my whole life, but this had forced me to face it head on. I packed a bag, my hands still trembling as I shoved clothes into it. I couldn't think clearly, couldn't focus on the task at hand. My mind kept going back to that figure, the way it had looked, the way it had spoken. And most of all, the way it had made me remember things I thought I'd forgotten. I left the apartment that night, the door clicking shut behind me with an eerie finality. The darkness outside seemed almost welcoming, a reprieve from the overwhelming sense of dread that had filled the apartment. But the truth was, I didn't know where to go. I couldn't stay in the city. My family wasn't here anymore, not since everything fell apart. So, I did what I always did when things got too overwhelming. I ran. I checked into a small motel on the outskirts of town. The room smelled faintly of mildew and cleaning chemicals, but at least it was quiet. There was no one here, no one to remind me of what had happened, no one to whisper my name in the middle of the night. I sank onto the bed, pulling the thin blanket around me, but sleep didn't come easily. The hours passed in a blur, my mind swirling with fragmented memories and fragmented thoughts. I kept hearing that voice, soft, pleading, full of longing. It wasn't just the voice of a shadowy figure in my apartment, it was the voice of a past I couldn't escape. The next morning, I woke to the harsh light of day streaming through the motel window. I hadn't slept much, and my head ached from the sleepless night. I tried to brush off the lingering sense of unease, but it clung to me like a second skin. I sat up in the bed, staring at the blank walls of the motel room. I realized then that I could keep running, but it would never be enough. No matter how far I went, no matter how many doors I closed behind me, the past would always be there, waiting. I had to face it. I drove back to the city that afternoon. The drive was long and empty, the road stretching out before me like a path I couldn't turn away from. I didn't know what I was hoping for, but I knew I had to go back to my apartment. I needed to confront whatever had happened, to figure out what had been tormenting me for so long. When I arrived, I stood outside the door for several minutes, just staring at it. It looked like any other apartment door, normal, unassuming. But to me, it felt like the doorway to a different world, one filled with memories I wasn't ready to relive. But I knew I had no choice. I opened the door and stepped inside. The apartment was quiet, eerily still. Nothing had changed since the night I left. The walls still bore the faint marks of years of wear and tear. The same photographs hung on the walls. But something was different now. The air felt lighter, almost as if the weight of the events had lifted in my absence. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, maybe an explanation, maybe some sense of closure. But there was nothing, just emptiness. It wasn't until I sat down in the living room, my eyes drifting over the familiar surroundings, that I understood. The figure in the darkness, the voice on the phone, they weren't just some supernatural manifestation. They were the embodiment of everything I had ignored and pushed away. They were the lingering traces of a relationship I had never truly resolved. I could feel my father's absence, like a cold weight pressing down on my chest. The memories of him, of my childhood, of everything I had tried to bury, came rushing back with a painful clarity. I hadn't wanted to face it all. I hadn't wanted to deal with the guilt, the anger, the loss. But I couldn't run anymore. The figure, the version of me that had haunted me, wasn't just angry at me for leaving. It was angry because I hadn't forgiven myself. I hadn't allowed myself to mourn, to grieve properly, to say goodbye. And now, it seemed that I had no choice but to do that. I sat there for hours, tears streaming down my face as I spoke to the empty apartment. I told my father I was sorry. I told him I wished I had done things differently, that I wished I had been brave enough to face the truth while he was still here. I didn't know if it would change anything, but in that moment, I needed to say those words. The apartment felt different when I stood up to leave. The shadows were no longer oppressive, and the air no longer felt thick with something unspoken. I wasn't sure if that meant the ordeal was truly over, but I felt lighter, at least for the first time in years. As I closed the door behind me and stepped back into the world outside, I realized something. Some things may never be fully resolved. I might never understand everything that happened, never have all the answers. But for now, that was okay. I couldn't change the past. I couldn't undo the mistakes I'd made, but I could stop running from it. I could let go. As I drove away from the apartment for the last time, I felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't the peace of resolution, at least not completely, but it was the peace of acceptance. I would never fully escape the shadows of my past, but I had taken the first step toward forgiving myself. And that, in itself, was enough. The days that followed felt like a blur, a haze of normality trying to settle back into a life that had been anything but. I'd returned to the city, back to my apartment, though I rarely stayed there for long. The memories of everything, of the strange phone calls, the figure that seemed to walk straight out of my mind, and the long unresolved past were all still there, lingering in the corners of my thoughts. But something had changed. I didn't know if it was because I had finally faced the truth, or if the ordeal itself had simply burned itself out, but there was a sense of quiet that had settled in. It wasn't that the past had disappeared, nor that I had all the answers. Far from it. The voicemail still sat there on my phone, the one with my voice, my very own voice, pleading for me to return home. The figure, too, remained in the back of my mind, as if waiting for me to doubt everything I'd come to believe about the events that transpired. But somehow, it no longer haunted me. Not in the way it once did. Maybe I had learned to accept that not everything has an answer. Maybe the fear was never about solving the mystery, but about confronting what the mystery represented. It wasn't about whether the voice was truly mine, or if the figure had some supernatural origin. It was about what those things were really asking of me. What had I been running from all those years? And why had it taken something so jarring to make me face it? Life, as it often does, moved on. I returned to work, started seeing friends again, and slowly rebuilt my routines. It felt good, and yet it also felt strange. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for something else to happen, but nothing ever did. It was as if the events of those weeks had been a nightmare that I was now awake from, but it wasn't a clean break. There was still a scar, still a mark left on me from the experience. I stopped checking my phone for messages from that number. I stopped listening to the voicemail, though part of me still felt the pull to know what more it might say, what else I might hear. But each time I looked at it, I couldn't bring myself to press play. The truth, it seemed, was still elusive. And maybe, just maybe, I didn't need to know all the answers. I began to appreciate the quiet moments, the stillness that I had once been afraid of. At night, when the apartment was dark, I didn't feel that same sense of dread I had before. Sure, there were times when I could still hear a faint echo of that voice in my mind, but it no longer filled me with the same panic. In some strange way, it had become part of my story, part of my history that I had to live with, not run from. I had thought for so long that finding the answers, uncovering the cause of the phone calls, the figure, would bring me peace. But the truth was, the peace didn't come from resolution, it came from acceptance. The past was never going to be erased. There would always be unanswered questions, things that didn't make sense, things I would never fully understand. But I had learned to live with that. I began to let go of the guilt, the fear that had gripped me for so long. I started to understand that forgiveness wasn't something you always earned from others, it was something you had to give to yourself. The past would always be a part of me, but it no longer controlled me. And yet, every now and then, when the house is silent and I'm alone in the dark, I still wonder. I wonder if the figure I saw was truly a manifestation of something outside of myself, or if it had been a product of my mind, reflecting the pain and fear I had buried for so long. I wonder if there was ever really a haunting, or if I had simply been haunted by my own past, my own choices. But in the end, I don't dwell on it. I don't seek to understand every detail. Because sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't the unknown, it's the truth we're afraid to confront within ourselves. The phone calls, the voice, the figure, they had all served their purpose. They had brought me face to face with the parts of myself I had spent my whole life avoiding. And in that, there was a certain kind of relief. It was a Tuesday night, around 10:30 p.m., and I was working the late shift at a convenience store. The kind of shift that drags on endlessly, where the hours seem to stretch like shadows, and the world outside feels far away. The store was tucked in the corner of a quiet, small town, a place where people knew each other by name, and the most excitement you'd get on a typical evening was the occasional late-night customer picking up snacks for a midnight movie or grabbing a pack of cigarettes before heading home. I was used to the rhythm of it, all the monotonous beeping of the register, the soft hum of the freezer section, and the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights above. The store itself wasn't anything special. A few aisles, an ice cream freezer, a coffee station, and the front counter where I spent most of my shift, waiting for the clock to hit 6 a.m. That night, like any other, I was alone in the store. My shift partner had called out, leaving me to handle everything from stocking shelves to dealing with whatever customers trickled in. The staff was usually just me, and on rare occasions, a manager would pop in for a few minutes. But it was mostly just me and the regulars. People from around the neighborhood would stop by on their way home from work or after a long night out. The quiet hum of the store was comforting, like the heartbeat of the town itself. It was routine. It was normal. Or at least it had been. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary that night. It was the usual crowd, people stopping in for snacks, a couple of college kids getting energy drinks for their all-night study sessions, and the older folks who came in for their late-night coffee. I had been on the clock for a few hours when the first strange thing happened. But at that point, it seemed like nothing more than a slight inconvenience, a fluke, perhaps. Nothing that could have prepared me for the odd series of events that would follow. But let me start by telling you a little bit about myself. I've been working at this convenience store for over a year. It's a job that doesn't require much thought, just the ability to make it through the night with your sanity intact. I didn't mind it, mostly. The pay was decent, and there were worse ways to spend my evenings than in a warm, quiet store. Still, it was just a job, a place to pass the time and make a living. But there's something about the late shift that makes you see things differently. There's a sense of isolation that starts to settle in after the sun goes down. The world outside seems distant, as if you're on the edge of it. The hum of the lights grows louder. The aisles of snacks start to feel like they're closing in, and you become keenly aware of the silence that surrounds you. There's no one to talk to, no one to distract you. You're alone with your thoughts, and the night stretches out before you, unending. I hadn't noticed it then, but the store itself, its worn floors, the flickering lights, the odd way the air smelled like stale coffee and rubber was starting to feel different. It wasn't anything tangible, just a feeling deep in my gut that something was off. But I pushed it aside. It was just a feeling, nothing more. Around midnight, the store's quiet routine was interrupted by the sound of the door chime. I looked up from my phone, expecting the usual. It was an older man, probably in his 60s, wearing a weather jacket and a pair of scuffed boots. He shuffled in slowly, his hands buried deep in his pockets. His face was lined with age, and his eyes, dark, almost too dark, seemed to look right through me, as if I wasn't even there. He didn't speak at first. He just walked down the aisles, stopping here and there to examine the goods on the shelves. The older man moved with a strange slowness, as if he was trying to decide on something. After a minute, I saw him near the freezer section, standing perfectly still, staring at the ice cream section, but not really looking at it. I figured he was just another regular, but there was something about the way he stood there, unmoving, that made me uncomfortable. It wasn't normal. It was like he was waiting for something or someone. It felt as though the seconds were stretching longer, the silence in the store thickening. I tried to shake off the feeling. This was just another customer, I told myself. But as I looked at him, something felt wrong. There was no sound, just the faint buzzing of the overhead lights and the hum of the freezer. No footsteps, no jingling of keys, just the weight of the man's presence in the room. A few moments passed, and he finally turned around, still not looking at me, and made his way toward the counter. His movements were slow, almost mechanical. He placed a pack of gum on the counter and, with a slow, deliberate motion, handed me a crumpled bill. I took it from his hand, my fingers brushing against his cold skin, and rang him up without saying a word. When the transaction was complete, he didn't thank me or even acknowledge that I was there. He simply turned and walked out the door, leaving behind a thick silence that seemed to settle over the store. At that moment, I thought little of it. I was just trying to make it through the night. But something stayed with me, that unsettling silence, the strange, unblinking stare he had given me, the way he walked, like he wasn't quite in a hurry, but also wasn't interested in being there. I shook my head. It was probably nothing, just the fatigue of the night getting to me. Still, I couldn't shake that odd feeling, the kind that settles in your chest and refuses to let go. And it wasn't the last time that night that I would feel it. But as the night wore on, things only became more unsettling. What seemed like a simple, quiet evening would soon take a turn into something much darker. And I had no idea just how deep I was about to go into it. The man who had wandered into the store was the first sign that something was off that night. His strange silence and the way he seemed to pause in time, as if he wasn't entirely present in the world around him, left me unsettled. But after he left, things returned to their usual routine, or so I thought. That is, until the events that followed started to build on the strange foundation he had left behind. It was around 1 o'clock when I began to notice the first signs of something unusual. The store, which had been mostly quiet up until that point, began to feel different. The air felt heavier somehow, as though the weight of the night had grown more oppressive. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something was shifting, and I was starting to realize that I wasn't alone in feeling it. I had just finished stocking a shelf near the back of the store when I heard it, just a faint sound at first, something soft but distinct. It was a thudding noise, like something gently bumping against the wall. At first, I thought it was just the freezer acting up, or maybe a stray item that had fallen off a shelf. But then I heard it again. This time, it was louder. It was coming from the far corner of the store, near the restroom door. I stared at the spot for a moment, unsure of what to do. The noise continued, a low, rhythmic thud that seemed to echo throughout the otherwise silent store. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. There was nothing in the corner. I'd checked it just a few minutes ago. I was sure of it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I walked toward the noise, my footsteps soft on the tile floor. As I neared the corner, the sound stopped. The stillness was almost worse than the noise itself. I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing with possibilities. I'd worked late shifts before, and I knew the store had its quirks: creaky floors, the occasional draft, but this felt different. There was something in the air that made the back of my neck tingle. I walked over to the restroom door, which was slightly ajar. The flickering overhead lights created strange shadows along the walls, casting distorted shapes on the tile floor. I pushed the door open just enough to peek inside. Nothing, just the usual restroom, empty. The sound had stopped. I even checked the stalls, half expecting to find someone hiding in there, but it was clear. I let out a breath, half relieved, half frustrated. I stood there for a moment longer, just staring into the dim light of the restroom. Nothing was out of place. No signs of anything strange. So why did I feel like I was being watched? I shook my head, dismissing it as just the fatigue of a long shift. Maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe I was starting to get a little too caught up in the weirdness of the night. But deep down, I knew something had happened, something I couldn't explain away. I turned and walked back to the counter, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. As I passed the freezer section, my eyes caught something unusual, a small puddle of water near the bottom. It wasn't much, but it stood out against the otherwise dry floor. I knelt down to inspect it, but when I touched the puddle, I felt a coldness that sent a shiver down my spine. I looked around, wondering if maybe the freezer had malfunctioned and leaked. But the freezer was still running, humming along as usual. There was no sign of anything wrong. I wiped up the puddle with a towel, but as I stood up to put the towel away, something caught my eye. The ice cream section had shifted. I could see it now, a slight bulge in the door of the freezer, as if something had pushed against it from the inside. I frowned, confused. I had just checked the freezer earlier, and it had been fine. There was no way something could have shifted like that on its own. I reached out to pull open the freezer door, and as soon as I touched the handle, the lights above flickered violently. The sudden flash of light made me jump, and for a moment, I thought the power was going to cut out. But then the flickering stopped, and everything returned to normal. The freezer door swung open with a groan, and I peered inside. All the ice cream containers were still in place, just as I had left them. But there, sitting in the back, hidden behind a few cartons, was a small, dark object. I reached in and pulled it out, heart pounding in my chest. It was a key, just a plain, rusted key. But it didn't belong to the store. I was certain of that. There was no reason for a key to be tucked away behind the ice cream. I held it for a moment, staring at it, before setting it down on the counter. What was it doing here? Why had it been hidden in the freezer? I couldn't make sense of it, but I was starting to feel a deep sense of dread creep up on me. Something wasn't right. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I was slipping into something I wasn't prepared for. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Customers came and went, but the uneasy feeling stayed with me, lingering in the corners of the store. Every little sound seemed amplified, each creak of the floorboards, every click of the register. Even the hum of the overhead lights felt too loud, too insistent. At around 3 a.m., I decided to take a short break. I stepped outside for some fresh air, hoping it would clear my head. The night was cold, and the air smelled faintly of rain, though none had fallen. The streetlights cast long shadows, and the parking lot was almost completely empty, save for a few cars parked near the store. The quiet was deafening. I leaned against the side of the building, trying to relax, when I heard something. A sound coming from inside the store. It was faint at first, like the soft rustling of paper. But as I listened, it grew louder. It wasn't just paper. It sounded like something or someone was moving around inside. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't seen anyone come in recently, and I was sure the door had been locked. I turned and rushed back inside, my steps quick and frantic. As I pushed open the door, I felt a wave of cold air hit me. But it wasn't coming from the outside. It was coming from within the store itself, from the direction of the freezer section. I glanced around, trying to steady my breath, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Something was waiting. The silence in the store had grown thick, oppressive. I slowly walked toward the freezer, my eyes scanning every shadowed corner of the room. And that's when I saw it. The freezer door was open again. This time, it wasn't just slightly ajar. It was wide open, and the cold air poured out like a frozen breath. I approached cautiously, dreading what I might find inside. But there was nothing there. No strange objects, no keys, no clues. Just the rows of ice cream, looking as mundane as they always had. But as I turned to leave, I felt it. That sensation. A cold hand on the back of my neck, a feeling of being watched. I froze, my blood running cold. There was no one else here. I was alone. But somehow I didn't feel alone. I quickly shut the freezer door, locked it, and walked back to the counter, my heart still pounding. I had no answers, no explanations. Only that feeling, that unsettling, nagging feeling that something was wrong, something was watching me. The night had grown deeper, and so had the unsettling atmosphere within the store. The hum of the fluorescent lights above was constant now, like a low, monotonous pulse that matched the beating of my own heart. Each time I looked at the clock, the minutes seemed to drag on, stretching out the already interminable hours of the shift. The tension in the air was thick, palpable, a feeling I couldn't shake. The store, usually a mundane place, had become something else entirely. It had turned into a space where I was no longer just working a shift. I was on edge, waiting for something to happen. At first, the strange events were minor, a bump in the night here, a flicker of lights there, but as the hours went on, they started to escalate. It was as if something was slowly and deliberately increasing the intensity of the bizarre occurrences, and I found myself slipping deeper into a state of unease, unsure of what was real and what was my own overactive imagination. It was around 4:30 a.m. when the next incident happened. I was at the register, scanning through a few inventory lists on my phone, trying to distract myself from the sense of dread that had settled in my stomach. The store was empty, save for a couple of random snacks on the counter from previous customers. I had just glanced up when I saw it, a figure standing by the entrance. The store's glass doors were fogged up, and the dim streetlights outside cast long shadows. But this figure, tall and still, seemed to blend into the darkness just beyond the door. I blinked a few times, trying to clear my vision, but when I looked back, the figure was gone. The door had been empty. I wasn't sure if I had seen it at all, but the lingering image of the silhouette haunted me. I had an overwhelming sense that something was just waiting for me, just outside, watching, waiting for the right moment to enter. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. It had to be my tired mind playing tricks on me. But the feeling of being watched remained, an oppressive weight on my chest. The air felt colder, despite the fact that the thermostat was set to a comfortable temperature. And the longer I stood there, the more the store began to feel like a place I didn't belong, like I was trespassing in a space that wasn't meant for me. Trying to distract myself, I moved down the aisles, checking the shelves to make sure everything was stocked. I passed by the freezer section, and as I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The temperature near the freezer had dropped, and it was as if a thin, icy breeze was coming from somewhere close. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I reached for the freezer door, but as soon as my hand brushed against it, the lights above flickered again, only this time they didn't stop. The flickering grew more violent, strobing in and out, the buzzing sound of the lights becoming more pronounced. My stomach churned as I watched the freezer door tremble slightly, the handle shifting as if someone or something was trying to open it from the inside. I took a step back, my breath shallow. It was as if the store had become alive, responding to some unseen force that was beyond my understanding. I had no explanation for the lights flickering, no reason for the freezer to be reacting like that. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone watching me from the shadows, but the store remained empty. I had to know what was going on. I couldn't just keep waiting for things to get worse without trying to understand them. The dread in my chest was growing, but curiosity gnawed at me, compelling me to investigate further. I decided to start by checking the security footage. Maybe there was anything on the cameras that could explain the strange occurrences. I made my way to the security office, which was located in the back corner of the store. The office was small and cramped, cluttered with old paperwork and outdated monitors. I turned on the monitor, watching the grainy footage of the store from different angles. It was silent at first, just the usual footage of empty aisles and the occasional car passing by outside. But as I scrolled through the footage, my eyes caught something. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I saw it. A shadow, a dark figure moving across the aisles in the far corner of the store. It wasn't a person. I could tell that much. It moved too quickly, too erratically. One moment, it was there, and the next, it was gone, slipping out of view as if it had never been there at all. My heart raced as I rewound the footage, watching it again, but this time, I felt a chill run down my spine as I noticed something even more disturbing. The figure wasn't the only thing moving. The shelves, the products, they were shifting ever so slightly, as though something invisible was pushing them, rearranging them without any physical presence. I rubbed my eyes, trying to convince myself that it was just a glitch in the footage, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I had seen it with my own eyes, and the footage confirmed it. There was something in the store, something that didn't belong. I quickly turned off the monitor and stood there in the dark, my thoughts racing. What was happening? Who or what was causing this? And why? Was I just imagining things, or had I stumbled upon something that I shouldn't have? As I stood there, trying to steady my breathing, I heard it again, the soft thudding noise from earlier, the one I had dismissed as my imagination. This time, it was louder, more distinct, as if it was coming from the walls themselves. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was unmistakable. It was like someone or something was knocking from the other side of the wall, trying to get in. I stepped back, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. The noise continued, steady and rhythmic, echoing through the walls, growing louder with each passing second. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to know what was causing it. I took a deep breath and moved toward the back wall, where the knocking seemed to be coming from. The sound was growing, pulsing through the air like a heartbeat, making the very walls feel alive. As I reached the wall, the knocking stopped suddenly, cutting off as abruptly as it had started. The silence that followed was deafening. I waited, holding my breath, unsure of what to do next. The coldness in the air had grown more intense, and the store felt smaller somehow, like the walls were closing in on me. I pressed my hand against the wall, hoping to find some rational explanation for what was happening, maybe a loose pipe or something else that could account for the noise. But there was nothing, just the cold, smooth surface of the wall. I pulled my hand back and turned around, trying to shake the eerie feeling that had settled in my bones. But the moment I turned, I saw it again. In the far corner of the store, by the restroom, the figure from earlier was back. It wasn't standing still anymore. It was moving slowly, deliberately, almost gliding across the floor. I could barely make out its shape in the dim light, but there was no mistaking it. It was there, just out of reach, waiting. I had no idea what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't alone in the store anymore. Something had followed me in. Something was moving through the aisles, and I was running out of time to figure out what it wanted. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, watching the figure move through the store. The shadow was no longer subtle, it was unmistakable now. It was tall, lanky, and moved with a strange fluidity that defied human movement. It didn't walk, it glided, its legs hardly bending as it shifted from one end of the store to the other, like it was being carried by an invisible force. The fluorescent lights flickered above me, casting sharp, stuttering shadows on the walls. The air had grown impossibly cold, so cold that I could see my breath condensing in the frigid atmosphere. I should have called someone who could help. I should have run, locked the doors, and gotten out. But my body wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed, my mind racing with a million thoughts, each one more irrational than the last. Was I dreaming? Had I been working too long, the exhaustion warping my senses? Or was this something far more sinister? The more I tried to rationalize it, the more my gut told me that there was no escaping this. What I was seeing, it was real. The figure had stopped moving now, standing still in the middle of the aisle, as though waiting for me to make the first move. The dim light made it hard to see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, burning through the dimness. My pulse was hammering in my ears, drowning out every other sound except the deafening silence that stretched between us. I don't know why I moved, but I did. Slowly, cautiously, I stepped forward, my feet dragging across the cold tile floor. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence like a weight pressing down on me, forcing me forward. I had to know what this thing was. I had to know if it was real or if I was losing my mind. The air felt thick now, charged with something I couldn't explain. It was as though the very walls of the store had closed in on me, tightening the space, suffocating me with every breath. I reached the aisle and paused, my hand trembling as I reached for the counter, the only thing between me and the figure. I tried to steady myself, but the shaking only grew worse. It was then that the figure moved again, but this time it didn't glide. It lunged. The sudden movement took me completely by surprise. My heart skipped a beat, and I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet. I crashed into the shelf behind me, sending cans and bottles crashing to the floor, but the sound was drowned out by a low, guttural growl like the rumble of distant thunder, only much closer. The growl seemed to come from the figure itself, its mouth now wide open, revealing a set of teeth that were far too sharp, far too long to be human. I backed away, the cold tiles slick beneath my feet. Panic flooded my system, my limbs now trembling so violently I could barely stand. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. All I could hear was the pulse of blood in my ears, the thudding of my heart, and that damn growl growing louder, deeper, more animalistic. And then, without warning, it spoke. The voice was a rasp, harsh and otherworldly, scraping against my mind like a knife. "You should not be here." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. It was impossible. How could something like this speak? But those words sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I could only stare as the figure's eyes, now glowing with a sickly, unnatural light, bore into me. Its form shifted slightly, and I realized that it wasn't just one figure. There were more, lurking behind it, like shadows bleeding from the walls. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but as I looked closer, I saw the outlines of others, dozens of them huddled in the dark corners, watching me with their glowing eyes. They were all around me, surrounding me, each one waiting for something, perhaps for me to make a mistake. I was no longer alone in this store. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't find my voice. The terror paralyzed me. The store, once so familiar, now felt like a prison, a trap I couldn't escape from. I had to run. I had to get out. But the closer I moved toward the door, the stronger the pull became. The air itself seemed to resist me, like invisible hands were pushing me back, forcing me to stay. The figure spoke again, its voice now louder, more insistent. "You've awakened them. Awakened them." What did that mean? What did it want from me? The words didn't make sense, but I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me, as though something I had done had unleashed something far worse than I could have ever imagined. I took a step back, trying to make sense of it all. My mind was racing, but I couldn't focus on any one thought long enough to piece it together. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, this time more violently than before, plunging the store into darkness for a brief moment. When the lights returned, I was no longer in the store. I was somewhere else. I don't know how to describe it. It was a place that defied all logic, a space that shouldn't exist. The shelves and aisles were gone, replaced by an endless void of darkness and mist swirling around me. The air smelled of decay, of something ancient and forgotten, and the ground beneath my feet was soft and unstable, like I was walking on damp earth. The figure stood in front of me, its form shifting, merging with the shadows. Its glowing eyes were the only thing visible in the dark expanse. "This is where they go when they are awakened," it said. Its voice was no longer a rasp, but a cold, dead monotone, as though it were reciting something it had said 1,000 times before. "And now you are here with us." I stumbled back, my heart pounding. This couldn't be real. I was dreaming. I had to be. But everything felt too real, the cold, the mist, the way the ground seemed to shift beneath me. I felt the walls close in, the weight of the darkness pressing down on me, crushing me with each passing second. I reached out, desperate for something to hold on to, but there was nothing. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the scene shifted again. The store returned, just as it had been before, dim lights, shelves lined with products, the eerie hum of the refrigerator. But it wasn't the same anymore. The air felt heavier, charged with a presence I couldn't see, but could certainly feel. I turned, and the figure was there again, standing in front of me, closer this time. Its eyes burned into mine, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. "You've seen it now," it whispered. "There is no going back." The fear I felt in that moment was unlike anything I had ever experienced. My chest constricted, my breath shallow, my body frozen with terror. And just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the figure lunged at me again. But this time, I didn't wait to see what happened next. The door was just a few feet away. With everything I had, I bolted for it, my legs carrying me faster than I ever thought possible. The figure's laughter echoed in my ears as I reached for the handle, but the moment my fingers touched the door, it jerked open. I didn't hesitate. I ran out into the cold night, into the empty parking lot, not daring to look back. The store loomed behind me, dark and silent, as if nothing had happened at all. But I knew better. Something was still inside. Something had followed me out, and it wasn't finished yet. I didn't look back as I sprinted across the parking lot, my heart hammering in my chest, each breath sharp and ragged. The cold night air stung my skin, but it did nothing to numb the fear pulsing through me. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get as far away from that place as possible. The car was parked at the far end of the lot, and every step I took felt like a weight dragging me down. My legs screamed in protest, but I pushed on, the sound of my pounding feet almost drowned out by the ringing in my ears. I reached my car, fumbled for the keys, and unlocked the door with shaking hands. As soon as I slid inside and slammed the door shut, I locked it and took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. But the relief was short-lived. The air inside the car was suffocating, filled with the stench of fear and panic that lingered around me like an invisible cloud. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that shadowy figure standing behind me. I didn't know what to think anymore. The events of the last few minutes, no, the last hour felt like a blur. Had it all been a nightmare? A figment of my overactive imagination? I couldn't bring myself to believe that. Everything felt too real, too visceral. The way the lights flickered, the coldness that had settled in the store, the figure that had haunted me, none of it felt like something I could explain away. But I was here now, in my car, miles away from the convenience store, and that had to count for something, right? I wasn't sure how much time had passed since I ran out, but the streets were eerily quiet, as if the world had gone still while I was in that store. I glanced out the window, half expecting to see something, anything. I didn't know what I was looking for, maybe a sign that what I had just experienced wasn't real. Or maybe, deep down, I was waiting for the inevitable, waiting for that figure to appear in the distance, its glowing eyes following me wherever I went. But the night was still. The streets were empty. I pulled out of the parking lot and drove aimlessly, not caring about where I was going. I couldn't go back to the store, not after what had happened. I didn't know what was waiting for me there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't seen the last of it. It was like something had attached itself to me, a dark presence that would never let me go. The drive was long, and my thoughts spiraled further into chaos. I couldn't stop thinking about the figure, its glowing eyes, the way it had spoken to me. "You've awakened them." What did that even mean? Who were they? What had I done to disturb them? I tried to focus on the road ahead, but the questions kept coming, each one more unsettling than the last. I finally pulled into a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town. I needed something, anything, to ground me, to make me feel like I wasn't losing my mind. The diner was practically empty, the lights buzzing overhead as I stepped inside. The waitress gave me a strange look as I walked in, but she didn't say anything. I took a seat in a booth in the corner, away from the windows, and tried to steady my nerves. I didn't know how long I sat there, staring at the coffee in front of me, my hands still trembling. The diner felt safe, almost mundane, compared to the nightmare I had just escaped. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was still with me, lingering just out of sight. My mind kept returning to the store, to the figures in the shadows, to the unnatural cold. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I wasn't going to be able to escape this. Not until I faced it head on. I paid for my coffee and left the diner, my eyes darting around as I stepped back into the night. The silence was deafening. I walked to my car, my breath visible in the cold air. I climbed inside and sat there for a long time, trying to figure out what to do next. I couldn't keep running, could I? There was no real safety, no real escape. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just something that could be avoided. It was something I had to confront. But where do you go when something like this starts following you? When you've awakened something that you weren't supposed to? That was the question I kept asking myself as I drove back toward the convenience store, my hands gripping the wheel tighter with every mile. I didn't know what I was going to find when I got there, but I had to know. I had to understand what was happening to me, to all of us who were drawn into that place. When I pulled into the parking lot, the store was as still as it had been before. The neon sign flickered slightly, casting an eerie glow over the empty lot. I parked in the same spot I had left from earlier, my stomach twisting with unease. There were no cars, no signs of life. It looked abandoned, but I knew it wasn't. It couldn't be. I sat there for a moment, staring at the store. The place that had once been so familiar, so mundane, now felt like a different world entirely. The door swung open, and I stepped out, my heart pounding in my chest as I walked toward the entrance. The bell above the door jingled softly as I stepped inside. The store was empty, but everything felt different now. The air was heavier, charged with an unsettling energy. The shelves were the same, the floor still slick with spilled drinks from earlier. But it felt as if the space had changed, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something. I walked past the aisles, my footsteps echoing in the silence, and as I moved toward the back of the store, I saw something. A small, black object on the floor. At first, I thought it was nothing, a piece of trash, maybe. But as I bent down to pick it up, I realized it was a key. A key to something, I wasn't sure what. My fingers curled around it, and the moment I touched it, the lights flickered again, and the temperature dropped. Something was still here. But as I looked around the empty store, I realized there was nothing left to do. No more answers, no more explanations. The only thing I knew for sure was that I couldn't stay. I couldn't keep searching for answers that didn't exist. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't something I could fix. I left the key behind and walked out of the store for the last time. As I drove away, I felt the weight of it all pressing down on me. What had I awakened? What had I unleashed? The questions would linger, but I was done looking for answers. The city lights shimmered in the rearview mirror as I drove further away from that place. The night was calm, too calm, and my thoughts were far from steady. There was a deep, gnawing sensation in my chest, an emptiness that refused to be filled no matter how far I went. I couldn't shake what had happened, what had almost happened. The moments inside that convenience store were burned into my mind, replaying over and over like a broken record. The darkness, the eyes, the feeling that something had shifted in the very air around me. It wasn't just a one-time event. It was something bigger, something I couldn't understand, and yet I couldn't ignore it either. I pulled into a small motel just off the highway, my hands still trembling slightly as I turned off the engine. I didn't know where else to go, and the thought of being alone in my apartment, in the same place where all of this had started, felt unbearable. The motel was as ordinary as they came, nothing fancy, just a room to sleep in. I paid for the night, got the key, and headed for the door, my thoughts constantly drifting back to that damn key I'd found on the floor. I should have left it behind. I shouldn't have touched it. But something in me knew that it was a symbol, an invitation, and once I had it in my hands, there was no going back. I took a long shower, trying to cleanse myself of the fear, but the chill in my bones wouldn't leave. The hot water did little to calm me, and when I stepped out, I was still cold. I wrapped myself in the thin motel towel, pacing around the room. I didn't feel safe. It was like I was being watched, even here, far from the convenience store. It wasn't until I laid down in bed, trying desperately to sleep, that the reality of it all settled in. I had been haunted, yes, but by what exactly? What had I awakened by stepping into that store? What were the creatures that had begun to make themselves known in those fleeting moments of darkness? What did they want? And perhaps most importantly, why me? I stared at the ceiling, my mind whirling with questions that had no answers. Maybe that was the worst part of all. The uncertainty, the terror of knowing that something had followed me, but I could never quite grasp what it was. It was just out of reach, like a shadow in the corner of my vision that disappears as soon as you turn your head. The minutes dragged on. My eyes were heavy, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of the figure with glowing eyes would flash before me, like a nightmare that wouldn't end. I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, that I had simply imagined it all. But deep down, I knew better. I had felt it, that unnatural coldness, that presence that hovered just behind me, watching. I couldn't just brush it off. I turned on the TV, needing the noise to distract me, but the familiar hum of static-filled commercials only seemed to highlight the silence in the room. My thoughts raced, and I pulled the covers tighter around me, my body tense. I knew I couldn't stay in this motel forever. I couldn't live in constant fear. At some point, I would have to face what had happened. But how? How does one face something like this? I rolled over, trying to find a more comfortable position, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that the walls were closing in on me. And that's when I realized something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I had forgotten the key. The key that I had found in the convenience store. The key that felt so familiar, so wrong. It had been sitting on the bedside table in the store, untouched by anyone. I should have left it behind when I ran out. But now, I was here, in this motel room, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had brought it with me. I was sure of it. It was still in my pocket. I froze for a moment, staring at the dim light of the motel room. A part of me wanted to throw it away, to get rid of it forever, but another part knew it was far too late for that. Once I had touched that key, once I had held it in my hand, I had crossed the line. And there was no going back. I reached into my pocket, the cold metal pressing against my fingers. The key felt different in the light of the motel room, more ominous, more heavy. It was just a simple, old-fashioned key, with no markings or clues about what it opened, but in that moment, I felt like it held the answer to everything. The silence in the room seemed to deepen as I turned the key over in my hand, studying it, trying to make sense of it. But it didn't make sense. Nothing made sense. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I stood up, pacing around the room once more, the key still clutched tightly in my hand. I had to leave, but I didn't know where to go. The only thing I knew for sure was that I couldn't go back to that store. Whatever was still lingering there had followed me, and no matter how far I drove, I wouldn't be able to escape it. But what if the key? What if the key was the answer? What if there was something in that convenience store, something beneath the surface, that needed to be unlocked? I didn't want to think about it. I didn't want to believe it. The ringing of my phone broke me from my thoughts. I jumped, my hand shaking as I grabbed it. It was a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but then curiosity got the better of me. Hello. There was a long pause on the other end. I could hear nothing but static. And then a voice, low and distorted, came through. You shouldn't have left. I felt my blood run cold. I dropped the phone, the sound of the voice still echoing in my mind. I didn't have time to think, to process what had just happened. I grabbed the key and left the motel room without looking back. Whatever it was that had begun in that convenience store, whatever dark force had latched onto me, it wasn't over. It wouldn't be over until I confronted it. I didn't know how, but I knew that I had no choice. I had to return, to finish it, to face whatever nightmare I had stirred. It was a long-awaited weekend getaway, something I had been planning for months. My friends and I had been swamped with work and life, and this trip was supposed to be our escape, our time to recharge. We had been browsing different options for a while, hiking, camping, maybe a quaint little cabin by the lake. But then we stumbled upon a hotel. Not just any hotel, but one that seemed too good to be true. It had excellent reviews, pristine photos of a modern, luxurious space, and an unbeatable price. The only catch: it was in a small, relatively quiet town a few hours away. But we were ready. It sounded perfect. We had booked the room online weeks in advance, double-checking everything: the dates, the location, and the amenities. We were excited. Nothing could possibly go wrong. The place seemed like an ideal retreat. We pictured ourselves enjoying the warmth of the fireplace, grabbing some drinks at the hotel bar, and enjoying a couple of days away from the noise of the city. As the day of our departure approached, I felt a wave of excitement. The closer we got, the more anticipation built up. I was packing my bags, thinking about all the simple pleasures, good food, relaxation, and a much-needed break. I could already imagine the fresh air and the peaceful surroundings of this small town. The morning we left, everything felt normal. We loaded up the car, put on our favorite music, and hit the road. The drive was long, but we were in good spirits. We laughed, talked about all sorts of things, and shared a few inside jokes. The landscape passed by in a blur: trees, small towns, and winding roads leading us to our destination. The road trip itself was filled with excitement and lighthearted chatter. As we drove, we didn't think twice about the reservation. After all, the online booking had been smooth and uneventful. I even checked the confirmation email one last time as we neared the town. Everything seemed perfectly fine. We arrived in the small town by late afternoon, and the place was as quiet as the online description suggested. It wasn't bustling with activity, which was exactly what we wanted. A peaceful, serene environment away from the chaos. We followed the directions to the hotel, which were clear enough, but something felt off. The buildings around us were old, but not in a charming way. They looked abandoned, with peeling paint and broken windows. Still, we pressed on. It was just the nature of a small town, right? We reached the hotel, and my heart sank just a little. It didn't look anything like the modern, upscale building in the photos. The exterior was worn-down, faded signage, an overgrown lawn, and a weathered front door. I looked at my friends, unsure of what to say. They were just as surprised as I was, but we had already committed, and it didn't seem like the kind of place that would turn us away. We figured we'd give it a shot. After all, we were already here, and what's a little surprise, right? Inside, the lobby was dimly lit, and the faint smell of dust lingered in the air. There was no one at the front desk. We waited for a moment, but no one appeared. A small bell sat on the counter, so I rang it lightly. A moment later, a woman appeared from the back. Her face was friendly, but her eyes seemed distant, almost vacant. She checked us in, and we were given a room key. It was an old-fashioned brass key, not the sleek modern ones we had expected. A small detail, but it struck me as odd. "Your room's on the second floor," the woman said, pointing toward the stairwell. She handed us the key with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I hope you enjoy your stay," she added, though her tone didn't sound like she believed it. We grabbed our bags and made our way to the second floor. The hallways were narrow, with peeling wallpaper and faintly creaking wooden floors beneath our feet. The atmosphere was quiet, almost unnervingly so. I had expected to hear the bustle of other guests, or at least the distant hum of a heater or air conditioning, but there was nothing. Just silence. When we reached our room, I hesitated before unlocking the door. The brass key turned with a loud click, and the door swung open slowly. What greeted us was not the picture of luxury we had imagined, but something far darker. The room was cramped and poorly lit, with worn-out furniture that had clearly seen better days. The bed was lumpy, the carpet threadbare. It felt like a place that hadn't been properly maintained in years. Still, we were determined to make the best of it. We dropped our bags and sat down, trying to laugh it off. Maybe we had misunderstood the pictures online, or maybe the place just hadn't been updated in a while. Regardless, we were stuck here for the night, and we decided to make the most of it. After all, the trip wasn't about the hotel, it was about the time away. Or so we thought. As we unpacked, one of my friends, Sarah, noticed something strange. A small note was tucked under the edge of the nightstand. It was handwritten, the paper old and yellowed. She picked it up, curious. The note simply read, "This room is not as it seems." We all exchanged uneasy glances. At first, we laughed it off, thinking it was just a quirky joke from someone else who had stayed here before. But as the words settled in my mind, I began to feel a creeping discomfort. It was the first odd thing we had encountered, but at that moment, it seemed insignificant. After all, we were here to relax, right? Little did we know, this was only the beginning of something far stranger than we could have ever imagined. Something that would soon make us question everything: our booking, the hotel, and our very reality. The first unsettling incident didn't happen all at once. It was subtle, almost too small to notice at first. But looking back, it was the kind of thing that should have been a red flag, something that, had we paid closer attention, might have changed the course of everything. But in that moment, it felt insignificant, just a tiny anomaly in the otherwise quiet atmosphere of the hotel. After settling into the room, we decided to explore a bit. The air outside had cooled, and the town, while not bustling, had a kind of calm to it that seemed perfect for an evening walk. The streets were empty, save for a few stray cars parked along the curbs. As we stepped out of the hotel, the bell over the door gave a faint, squeaky ring, and we found ourselves enveloped in the silence of the town. As we walked, we joked and laughed, our spirits still high despite the odd vibe we'd felt inside the hotel. The town had that air of being forgotten by time: old buildings, long-forgotten businesses, and the hum of distant traffic that barely seemed to touch this sleepy corner of the world. It wasn't the place I'd imagined when booking a modern retreat, but it had a strange charm to it. The cool evening air was refreshing, and it was easy to put the feeling of unease behind us. After a short walk, we returned to the hotel to grab some drinks at the bar. The bar area was tucked away in a dimly lit corner of the lobby. There were no other guests there, which felt odd. The bartender, an older man with a stern face, greeted us quietly, almost as if he were expecting us. We each ordered a drink, but none of us seemed eager to linger for too long. The silence in the bar, combined with the faded decor, made the space feel like it hadn't been used in years. We made our way back upstairs, deciding that it was time to call it a night. The plan was simple: take a quick shower, unpack the rest of our things, and get some sleep before heading out to explore the area the next day. As we walked down the narrow hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't any one thing, it was more like a low hum in the background, a sense that we were being watched, even though no one was around. The dim lighting, the quiet, and the strange feeling of being in a place that didn't quite feel real made the air heavier. When we got back to the room, I noticed that something had changed. It was subtle, so subtle that it could have been easily ignored, but the air felt different. The room was colder than before. I couldn't remember leaving the window open, but I went over to check anyway. The window was shut tight. It didn't make sense. The room had a drafty feeling, almost as if the walls themselves were breathing. I shrugged it off, figuring that it was just the temperature change outside, and went about getting ready for bed. My friends were already in the bathroom, getting ready themselves. I was about to climb into bed when something caught my eye, something odd. The lamp on the nightstand flickered. Just once. A small flash, but enough to make me stop. It wasn't like the usual flicker of a dying bulb. It was like the light had been turned off and back on in the blink of an eye. I froze for a second, trying to figure out if it had been a trick of the eye. But the lamp flickered again, and this time the bulb popped a sharp sound that made me jump. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice betraying a hint of unease. My friends, hearing the sound, came rushing over to me. They were immediately concerned. One of them reached for the lamp switch, trying to turn it back on. But the light wouldn't come on again. It just sat there, dim and useless, flickering for a second longer before it fell completely silent. "It's just a bad bulb," my friend said, trying to calm me down. "Nothing to worry about. Let's just go to bed." I nodded, but a part of me felt unsettled. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just the light. It was something about the timing, the way everything had happened so suddenly. But I didn't want to overthink it. We had been traveling all day, and fatigue was starting to hit. I tried to shake it off and get into bed. As I pulled the covers up, I noticed something else. The note under the nightstand, it was gone. The yellowed paper, the cryptic message, the one we had all read earlier that day, was no longer there. At first, I thought I had imagined it. Maybe I had put it back somewhere, or perhaps one of my friends had moved it without mentioning it. But when I asked, no one seemed to know where it had gone. I tried to laugh it off. It was nothing, right? But deep down, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something strange was happening. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe the hotel was older than I'd thought, and these kinds of things were to be expected in places like this. The night wore on, and I forced myself to sleep. But the next morning, the feeling didn't go away. We woke up to an eerie silence, the kind that only comes when you realize you've been alone for far too long. The hotel seemed even quieter than before. The hallways were empty, not a single sound in the air. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, something that should have been there. We decided to go down for breakfast, hoping a meal would help us shake off the oddness of the night before. As we made our way downstairs, we noticed something else. The lobby had changed. The furniture seemed to have been rearranged overnight, and a thick layer of dust had gathered on the counter, despite there being no signs of anyone having cleaned it recently. The woman who had checked us in the night before wasn't at the desk. Instead, there was an elderly man sitting there, his face stern and unmoving. He looked up at us as we entered, his eyes cold. But he didn't say a word. We made our way to the dining area, still unsure of what we were feeling. It wasn't until later that day, when we decided to visit the nearby park, that the feeling of strangeness really set in. As we passed through the small town again, we realized something: no one was around. It was like the town itself was completely deserted. The cars parked along the streets were the same ones we had seen when we first arrived, as if they hadn't moved in days. There were no other tourists, no one on the sidewalks, nothing at all. Just silence. It was as if the whole town had been frozen in time. And then, when we passed the hotel again, we saw it something that made my stomach turn. In one of the upper windows of the hotel, there was a shadow, a figure, dark and undefined, standing just behind the curtains. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but the longer I stared, the more convinced I became. The figure was there, and it was watching us. My friends didn't seem to notice. They were chatting among themselves, unaware of the creeping dread building inside me. I tried to shake off the thought, but it was hard. The figure never moved, never acknowledged us. It just stood there, frozen in the window. That was when the unease grew too strong to ignore. Something was wrong here. Something wasn't right. And whatever it wasn't something we were going to escape so easily. As the hours passed, the strangeness of the hotel began to increase quietly at first, but then in a way that was impossible to ignore. Each new incident was like a drop of water in a glass, building slowly until it was filled to the brim. At first, we thought we were just imagining things. After all, it wasn't uncommon to be a little on edge in an unfamiliar place. But as the days wore on, the events became undeniable. Something wasn't right at the hotel, and none of us could escape the growing sense of dread that followed us everywhere. It started with small things that could be easily brushed off as coincidences. For instance, the hotel's heating system seemed to malfunction every night. The air in the room was either freezing cold or unbearably hot. Despite adjusting the thermostat, the temperature never seemed to stabilize. One night, we'd all wake up shivering, wrapped in blankets, but unable to escape the cold air that seemed to seep in from nowhere. The next night, the opposite happened. The heat was stifling, and it felt as though the room had been sealed off from the outside world, trapping us inside a suffocating box. We asked the staff about it, but the answers we got only added to the confusion. The elderly man at the front desk, who had been there every time we returned, simply shrugged his shoulders and told us that old buildings have their quirks. His tone was flat, almost rehearsed, and it made my skin crawl. I wanted to ask more questions, but something in his eyes, an unsettling coldness, made me hesitant. But it wasn't just the temperature that was strange. There were other signs too, ones that gnawed at the back of our minds as the days went by. The lights in the hallway flickered constantly, like the hotel itself was struggling to stay alive. At night, we could hear faint sounds, scraping noises that came from somewhere above us. It sounded like something or someone was dragging something heavy across the floor. But when we went to investigate, there was never anyone there. The hallways were empty, and the sounds would stop as soon as we stepped into them, as though whatever was causing them knew we were listening. And then there was the room. Each time we returned after being out, it felt off. The bed would be made, but the blankets seemed too tight, too perfect. The curtains would be drawn, and the room would have a faint, musty smell to it, as if it had been sealed off for a long time. We never saw anyone in the hallways, and yet it always felt like someone had been in our room while we were gone. But the most disturbing part of all was the silence. The hotel was eerily quiet, no sounds of footsteps, no laughter or conversation. The only noise came from the creaks of the building as it settled, and the occasional gust of wind outside. It was the kind of silence that felt unnatural, as though the world around us had been frozen in time. One evening, we decided to investigate. The last few days had been unbearable, and we needed answers. Our curiosity had grown to the point where it felt like we had no choice but to explore what was really going on. We started with the hotel's front desk, hoping to find some clue about the strange occurrences. The elderly man was there as usual, sitting behind the counter with a vacant expression. He didn't even look up as we approached. It felt like we were invisible to him, like we didn't belong in the space. "Excuse me," I said, trying to mask the nervousness in my voice. We've been experiencing some odd things here. The temperature changes, the sounds at night. Could you tell us if anything is wrong with the building?" The man didn't respond right away. He simply continued to stare at the counter, his hands resting on the wood as though he were waiting for something to happen. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he lifted his gaze. His eyes were clouded, unfocused. "Old buildings have their quirks," he repeated. "Nothing unusual." His words were too rehearsed, too practiced. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I had to fight the urge to turn around and leave. But I pressed on. "Is there anyone else staying here?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "No," he replied, his voice low. "Not at the moment." That wasn't true. We had seen people earlier, walking around the town, and there were cars parked outside. But I didn't press him further. Something about the way he spoke made me feel like I was asking the wrong questions. The longer I stood there, the more I felt like I was intruding on something I wasn't supposed to know. We left the front desk and decided to investigate the building itself. It wasn't exactly a mansion, but it was old, probably dating back at least 100 years. We figured that the more we explored, the more we'd uncover about the hotel's strange history. We started with the basement. The old door creaked as we pushed it open, and a musty smell wafted up from the stairs. We hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the better of us, and we made our way down into the darkness. The basement was cold, even colder than the rest of the hotel. The air felt damp, and the floors were uneven, as though the building had settled into the earth over the years. As we explored, we found old furniture stacked in corners, forgotten crates, and piles of old newspapers. It felt like we had stepped back in time, like we were walking through the remnants of a place that had been abandoned long ago. But then, as we turned a corner, we found something that sent a chill through my entire body. There, in the far corner of the basement, was a door. It was small, almost hidden behind a stack of old crates, and the wood was warped and cracked. The door looked like it had been sealed shut for years, its rusty hinges barely holding it in place. But the most disturbing part was the symbol etched into the wood. It wasn't anything I recognized, just a series of strange, jagged lines, like some kind of ritualistic design. I reached out to touch it, but as my hand made contact with the door, I heard something. A low, guttural sound, like breathing. It came from behind the door. My heart started to race, and I pulled my hand back, my body tense with fear. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to my friends. They both nodded, their faces pale. We stood frozen for a moment, listening to the sound, slow, labored breathing that seemed to echo from within the door. It wasn't a person. It was something else. We didn't want to know what was behind that door, but the question haunted us for the rest of the day. What was down there? What was hiding in the dark, waiting for us to find it? That night, we could hardly sleep. Every sound in the hotel seemed amplified. The wind rattled the windows, and the creaking of the building echoed through the halls. But the worst part was the feeling. It was the same feeling we had had when we first entered the hotel, the sense that something was watching us, something waiting. We decided to leave the hotel the next morning. But as we packed our bags and prepared to check out, I noticed something that stopped me dead in my tracks. The symbol, the same one from the basement door, was carved into the wood of the nightstand in our room. It was small, almost hidden, but it was there. And just as I reached out to touch it, the door to our room slammed shut. Something was inside the hotel with us, and it wasn't going to let us leave. The next morning, we were all on edge. There was an oppressive silence in the air, thicker than usual, and it felt like the walls of the hotel were closing in on us. We hadn't slept well. The events of the night before, Especially the breathing sound we had heard behind that hidden door in the basement kept playing in my mind. But despite our fear, we knew we couldn't leave until we figured out what was really going on. We couldn't just run away and leave unanswered questions lingering in the air. What had we stumbled upon? What was behind that door? And why did it feel like something or someone was watching us every moment we were there? We decided to go back down to the basement. This time, we couldn't ignore it any longer. We had to confront whatever was behind that door. Our fear weighed heavily on us, but something deeper, a need to understand, pushed us forward. We couldn't leave without knowing the truth. As we made our way down into the basement once again, the air felt colder than before, the darkness almost suffocating. The sound of our footsteps echoed in the silence, each step we took seeming to draw us further into the unknown. The basement felt like a different place, now more oppressive, more menacing. The faint smell of mildew and dust mixed with something else, something I couldn't quite place, something sharp and metallic like iron. The dim light from the single bulb hanging overhead barely illuminated the space, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. When we reached the far corner, where the door was hidden behind the crates, my heart started to race. The symbol, the same jagged design, was still carved into the door. It looked even more sinister now, as though the wood had been etched with a deeper, darker purpose. We didn't speak. There was no need for words. Our fear and the weight of the moment were understood without saying a thing. I moved forward and placed my hand on the door, feeling its cold surface. The metal symbol beneath my fingers felt hot to the touch, as if something was seeping from the door itself. The sensation sent a shiver up my spine. Suddenly, a low thud sounded from behind the door, one heavy thump, then silence. And then, just as I was about to step back, the door creaked. The hinges groaned as though they were being forced to move after decades of stillness. A split second of hesitation passed, but then, without warning, the door flung open. I froze. Beyond it was darkness. Pure, impenetrable darkness, as though there was nothing behind the door at all, just an endless void. But that wasn't what caught my attention. It was what moved in the darkness. A figure, vague at first, began to take shape in the pitch blackness. It wasn't human, not in any way I had ever seen before. It was tall, much taller than any person could be, with limbs that stretched too far, twisted in angles that defied nature. Its body was a shifting mass of shadow, but I could make out its eyes, two pinpricks of light that burned like cold, white flames. The creature didn't move at first, just stared at us from the other side of the void. The silence was deafening, and for a moment, I thought I might faint from the sheer terror of it all. My legs felt like they were made of stone, heavy and unresponsive. The thing seemed to regard us, observing, studying. Then it spoke not with words, but with a sensation that pierced through my mind like a knife. It wasn't a voice, it was a presence, a feeling that pressed against the very core of my being. It was as if the thing was the silence itself, and the fear seeped through every fiber of my being as it reached out, searching, probing. Leave. Now. The words echoed inside my head, but they weren't spoken by a voice. They came from the creature's mind, its consciousness. I could feel it in every inch of me, as though it had crawled into my brain and planted its thoughts there. My friends were frozen beside me, their faces as pale as mine. I wanted to scream, to run, to get out of there, but the fear was too overwhelming. My body refused to move. The thing's eyes glowed brighter, and I could feel its attention turning toward each of us, as if it was weighing our worth, deciding what to do with us. It seemed to loom closer, though it did not physically move. The very air around us thickened as though the space was warping, bending in impossible ways. It was like we were standing in the eye of something ancient, something far older than any of us. And then, without warning, something snapped inside me. I didn't know what drove me to do it, but I bolted. I turned and ran, not caring that I didn't know where I was going. My legs moved on their own, pushing me forward through the thick, oppressive air of the basement. I could hear my friends behind me, but their voices sounded distant, muffled, as if they were trapped in some other world. The only thing that mattered now was getting out of that basement. I burst through the door of the hotel and into the daylight, gasping for breath. My heart hammered in my chest, and I felt like I was on the verge of collapsing. We all stood there, panting, looking at each other in disbelief. The world felt strange, as though the line between reality and whatever that thing was had blurred, and we were caught in the middle. What was that? One of my friends finally managed to ask, his voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. There was no explanation, no words that could describe what we had just seen or what we had almost become a part of. The thing in the basement, that entity, it wasn't something we could simply walk away from. I could still feel it in my mind, that cold, ancient presence pressing against my thoughts. The fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of my mind. We decided to leave the hotel, but even as we packed our bags and walked toward the front door, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us, lingering in the corners of the hotel, watching our every move. The old man at the front desk was still there, sitting behind the counter, as though nothing had happened, but when he looked up at us, his eyes, they were different. There was a knowing look in his eyes, a cold, predatory gleam that sent a chill down my spine. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was something else, something tied to whatever dark force was behind the hotel, something that had been waiting for us. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his voice oddly calm, almost too calm. "You really should have stayed longer." We didn't say a word. We didn't need to. As we left the hotel, I glanced back over my shoulder, and for a split second, I thought I saw the figure in the window, its cold eyes watching us from within. And then the door slammed shut behind us. We didn't look back again. We left the hotel behind us, and with it, whatever had been haunting us within its walls. The drive out of town felt surreal, like I was trapped in a waking nightmare, my mind replaying every image, every detail of what we had seen. We didn't speak much during the journey. The silence was too heavy, too suffocating. The roads that once felt familiar now felt foreign, as if we were in a different world entirely. Each mile that put more distance between us and the hotel didn't feel like a release. It felt like we were running from something we could never truly escape. The further we drove, the more I could feel the weight of the experience sinking in. The terror, the confusion, the inexplicable feeling that something had followed us, had latched onto us like a shadow we couldn't shake off. We didn't even speak about it right away, because it was too difficult to put into words. How do you explain what we'd witnessed? How could we describe that thing in the basement, that entity that seemed to be both beyond this world and yet somehow very much a part of it? It was like our brains couldn't fully process what we'd experienced, as if the events were too far out of reach, too unnatural to understand. We checked into a motel hours later, the desire to be away from the strange town overpowering the need for rest. The room was small, and the air smelled of bleach and something faintly antiseptic, but it was familiar. It was a world that felt safe. I tried to focus on the mundane, on the small things that were supposed to make me feel normal again. The hum of the air conditioner, the rustle of a car passing by outside, the soft scent of fabric, softener on the sheets. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, a growing unease that refused to leave. We stayed there for a few days, trying to recover, to make sense of what had happened. We didn't talk about the basement much, though the images were etched into my mind, The figure, the eyes, the darkness that consumed everything. At night, I could still hear that strange breathing sound echoing in my ears. It was as if I was still trapped in that basement, stuck in that moment where time had stopped and everything had shifted into something we couldn't explain. But life didn't stop. Eventually, we found ourselves back at home, still unsettled, still trying to process what we had encountered. We couldn't speak about it to anyone, not to family, not to friends, because no one would believe us. How could we explain the horror of what we had seen? Who would understand the feeling of that creature's presence in our minds? We couldn't even speak to each other about it without the conversation spiraling into an uncomfortable silence. No one had answers. We tried to move on, to put the whole experience behind us, but it was impossible. The fear didn't fade, and the memories didn't soften with time. In fact, they only became sharper, more vivid, as though they were imprinted on the inside of my eyelids. At night, I could still see the shadowy figure, still feel its burning eyes on me. The feeling of dread never left, and it gnawed at me, even when I tried to shut it out. I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, checking for shadows, for signs that something or someone was there, waiting. We tried to research the hotel, the history behind it. We Googled everything we could, but no matter how hard we searched, we found nothing. The hotel didn't exist in any records, at least not under the name we had booked. There were no reviews, no old articles, no history. It was as if the place had been erased from time itself, a ghost hiding in plain sight. We wondered if it had been an illusion, some sort of trick our minds had played on us, but that didn't explain what we had seen, the way the world had twisted and turned around us, the way the hotel had felt so wrong, so impossibly out of place. We tried to reach out to the town's local authorities, but they denied ever hearing about a hotel at that location. They had no idea what we were talking about, and the more we pressed, the more their responses grew colder and more evasive. It was as if they had no desire to even acknowledge that such a place had ever existed. The strangest thing of all, though, was that none of us could remember how we had originally found the hotel. None of us could recall the exact website we had used to book it, no matter how hard we tried. The details about the booking itself, who had made the reservation, how we had paid, the confirmation email seemed to slip away like water through our fingers. We all agreed that it was like we had been led there, drawn into that place by something beyond our understanding. Days turned into weeks, and the world outside seemed to move on. Life continued, but something inside of me had shifted. I had been changed by the experience, though I couldn't fully explain how. I felt a constant unease that clung to me like a second skin. I didn't trust my own mind anymore. The lines between what was real and what had been an illusion blurred, and the fear began to take root, gnawing at my thoughts. At night, I would wake up to the sound of breathing, the same sound that had haunted me in that basement. It would stop suddenly when I opened my eyes, leaving me unsure whether it was my mind playing tricks on me or something much darker. I would lie there in the dark, heart pounding, waiting for the sound to return. Eventually, we all started to separate. We went our own ways, trying to leave the past behind us, but the experience remained, like a scar on our souls that could never be healed. None of us ever spoke about the hotel again, but we didn't need to. It was clear that whatever had happened there had left its mark on us all. We couldn't forget. We couldn't move on. I don't know if the hotel was real, or if it had been some sort of collective hallucination, some shared delusion brought on by stress or fear. I don't know if what we saw was a creature, an entity, or something else entirely. But I do know this. We were never supposed to be there. Something had drawn us into that place, and it had tried to keep us, tried to pull us deeper into its web. Maybe it was just a hotel, a building, an empty space. Or maybe it was something else, a place outside of time and reality, a doorway to something we couldn't understand. All I know is that it was real enough to leave a permanent mark on our lives. The experience had changed me, and I could never shake the feeling that something had followed us home, that the terror we had felt in that hotel was just the beginning of something far worse. We never went back to that town, and we never spoke to each other again after that final conversation. It was as if the weight of what we had experienced had torn us apart in ways we couldn't fix. But every now and then, in the dead of night, I still hear the breathing. And I wonder if I'm ever truly free from whatever it was we encountered in that hotel. It's been years since we left that town behind, years since we stepped out of that cursed hotel, but the memories haven't faded. No amount of time or distance has been enough to erase the feeling that something was there with us, something we couldn't fully understand. I still can't explain it, and I don't think I ever will. I've tried to move on with my life. The days blend into each other, each one carrying its own set of routines and distractions. The things that once kept me up at night, those strange sounds, the overwhelming sense of being watched, have slowly faded, at least on the surface. I've gone on with my work, my relationships, the simple tasks that once felt ordinary, but now seem almost like distractions from something deeper, something unsettling. But there are moments when I'll be sitting alone, maybe watching TV or reading, and I'll feel it again, the cold weight of that experience creeping into my thoughts. It doesn't happen often, but when it does, it feels like a chill running through me, a sharp reminder of what I've tried to bury. I think about the others sometimes, the people I shared that nightmare with. I haven't spoken to them since we left that motel. I wonder how they've coped, what their lives are like now. But a part of me is afraid to find out. What if they've been just as haunted as I have? What if the thing that followed us didn't stop, didn't let go of us once we left that place? What if it still watches, waits for the right moment to pull us back, to finish what it started? I don't know if any of us truly escaped. There's a part of me that wonders if we were just the latest victims, a small group that wandered into something far larger, something that's been happening for much longer than we could have ever known. Maybe there are others who were drawn in and never made it out. Maybe it's not over. Maybe the hotel is still there, existing in some twisted corner of the world, still pulling people in, still trapping them in the same way it trapped us. Every now and then, when I'm scrolling online, I'll come across a strange story, a cryptic post, or a vague mention of a town I once knew. A hotel with no history. A place that shouldn't exist. It always makes me stop, just for a moment, and my heart skips a beat. I'll click the link, read a few lines, and then feel a sense of dread settle over me. But I always close the page quickly, as if doing so will protect me from whatever dark knowledge lies within it. I don't want to know if there are others like us. I don't want to hear about new visitors who have crossed the threshold and never returned. The fear is still there, buried deep, but never quite gone. I've learned to live with it. I've learned to push it aside when I need to keep going. But it's always in the back of my mind, that nagging question of whether the thing we saw, the thing we encountered in the basement, is still out there, waiting. The memory of those eyes, their cold, endless stare, remains etched in my mind like a scar that will never heal. I used to think that maybe I was imagining things, that I had been too tired, too stressed, and that everything we saw in that hotel was just a figment of our minds. But then I think back to the way the walls seemed to close in on us, the sounds that didn't make sense, the way time itself seemed to bend and twist. No, it wasn't just a bad dream. Something happened there, something real. And maybe that's the worst part, the knowledge that we may never fully understand it, that the answers may always be out of reach. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever go back to that town. Maybe I'll pass through on a road trip or find myself at a nearby gas station just to see what's left of it, if anything. But even the thought of it makes my stomach turn, because I know deep down that whatever that hotel was, it wasn't just a place. It was something more, something that exists outside of time, outside of our understanding. It had a purpose, a reason for being there, and it knew exactly what it was doing. I don't think I'll ever be free from it. I don't think any of us are. And maybe that's what haunts me most of all. The realization that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. Some things, once encountered, can never be forgotten. They stay with you, always waiting for the right moment to remind you that they're still there. As I sit here, reflecting on it all, I can't help but wonder if the hotel was just the beginning. If the horror we witnessed was only the surface, the first act in a much larger, much darker story. The kind of story that never really ends. So, as the years go by and I try to convince myself that I've moved on, that I'm free from the nightmare we lived through, I wonder, will I ever truly escape it? Or will it follow me, waiting to pull me back when I least expect it? Only time will tell. But for now, I'll keep moving forward, carrying the weight of the experience like a secret I can't fully share, always looking over my shoulder, always wondering if I'm being watched. Maybe that's the real horror, not knowing if it's still out there, not knowing if it's still coming for us. It was the kind of ordinary day that could easily fade into the background of our memory. The sun had set slowly, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, while the quiet hum of the city below echoed through the apartment windows. I had just returned home from work, the exhaustion of the day weighing down on my shoulders. It wasn't anything special, just another mundane evening. I remember thinking that life had become a series of these kinds of days, strung together in a monotonous loop. I've lived in this apartment for almost 3 years now. It's small but cozy, tucked away in a quiet part of town where not much happens. The building itself is old, with creaking floors and pipes that groan at night, but it's home. My daily routine is simple. I wake up, go to work, come home, and repeat. On evenings like this, I enjoy winding down with a book or scrolling through my phone, trying to forget about the grind of the workday. That night, I had just finished making myself dinner, a quick stir-fry, and was sitting down on the couch to eat when I heard it. The soft thud of something hitting the floor outside my door. At first, I didn't think much of it. I live in an old building, and the sound could have been anything. A package falling, maybe. A neighbor dropping something. But it didn't feel like a random noise. It was too deliberate. I waited for a few moments, listening carefully, but there was nothing more. I decided to ignore it. I finished my meal, cleaned up, and settled in with my book, trying to shake off the odd feeling that had crept up on me. But I couldn't. Something felt off. The air in the apartment seemed thicker, heavier, like it was filled with something I couldn't name. As I reached for my phone to distract myself, there was another noise. This time, it was unmistakable. A soft scrape along the floor, followed by a thud. It came from outside my door again. I froze. I couldn't explain why, but my heart started to race, and a strange unease settled in my stomach. I stood up, hesitating for a moment. The idea of checking outside my door felt wrong. But curiosity won out, and I made my way to the hallway, my footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. When I opened the door, I found nothing. There was no one in the hallway. No sign of anyone having been there. But on the ground in front of my door, there was an envelope. It was plain, unmarked, just a standard white envelope. I bent down and picked it up, wondering who would leave something like this outside my door, especially at this hour. I brought it inside and sat down on the couch, feeling the weight of the envelope in my hands. It wasn't heavy, but it felt significant, like it was holding something important. I stared at it for a while, unable to shake the nagging feeling that I was about to learn something I wasn't ready to know. Without another thought, I opened the envelope. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting on it was neat, but unfamiliar. I recognized the style, someone who was deliberate, careful with their words, but I had no idea who it could be. The paper was thin, almost too delicate, and the ink was dark, as if freshly written. The note was simple, but what it said made my stomach turn. It read, "I've been watching you for a long time. I know your routine. I know where you live." My fingers trembled as I held the paper, my heart pounding in my chest. I was in disbelief. Who would send something like this? Why? As I read those words over and over, I felt a sudden chill sweep over me. It wasn't just the message itself, it was the eerie accuracy of it. The note described things about my daily routine that no one else would know. The way I always stopped at the same coffee shop on my way to work, the brand of cereal I always bought, how I'd walk through the park every evening to clear my head. I couldn't explain it, but I felt the unmistakable sensation of being seen. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every creak of the apartment, every flicker of the lights made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting someone to be standing there. I tried to convince myself it was just a prank, a strange coincidence, but deep down, I knew it was something more. The next morning, I took the envelope to the police. They didn't seem too concerned, brushing it off as a prank. "People send weird stuff all the time," one of the officers told me with a smile, as if trying to reassure me. "You'll be fine." But I wasn't fine. Every day after that, I kept expecting to see something strange outside my door again. I checked the hallway constantly, even peering through the peephole before opening the door. I became hyper-aware of every sound, every movement in the apartment building. It was as though the envelope had set something in motion that I couldn't control. It was just another typical evening, or at least, that's what I tried to convince myself. After the encounter with the envelope, I expected things to return to normal, but they didn't. That subtle unease never quite left me. I started double-checking the locks on my doors, keeping the lights on a little longer than usual, and constantly glancing over my shoulder. The city outside my window felt both familiar and distant, like it no longer belonged to me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching. The following week, I kept my routine as best as I could. I went to work, made my usual stop at the coffee shop, and took my daily walk through the park. I told myself I was being paranoid. After all, what were the chances that something was actually going to happen? I tried to keep my mind busy with work, but it never fully focused. My thoughts kept drifting back to that envelope and the haunting words written on that paper. It wasn't until Thursday night that something happened, something small but enough to make me feel like I was losing control. It was around 9 o'clock when I came back from a late meeting at work. The sky had turned dark and the streets were mostly quiet. I remember walking down the hallway of my apartment building, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, and I found myself looking over my shoulder more often than usual. When I reached my door, I noticed something strange. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it, but then it hit me. There was a faint smell lingering in the air. It wasn't overpowering, but it was there. A mix of something metallic and something sweet. Almost like rotting fruit, but not quite. I paused, standing in front of my door, trying to figure out where the smell was coming from. The hallway was empty, but I could feel my heart rate picking up. I had no idea what it meant, but the sensation of being watched intensified. I reached for my keys and quickly unlocked the door, stepping inside. As soon as I closed it behind me, I felt the pressure in my chest ease a little. I figured it was just another odd quirk of the building, the pipes, maybe, or someone cleaning in the apartment next door. Still, the smell lingered in my mind. I went through my usual evening routine. I made myself a simple dinner, sat down to eat, and tried to relax. But the air in my apartment felt thick, heavier than usual. It was as if something was just beneath the surface, waiting for me to notice it. I had the strange sensation of being in someone else's space, like the walls were closing in around me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was the kind of fear that doesn't make sense but gnaws at you all the same. Then came the second unsettling moment. After dinner, I sat down on the couch and turned on the TV, hoping to distract myself. The apartment was quiet, the only sound coming from the hum of the air conditioning. I tried to focus on the show, but my eyes kept drifting to the hallway, as if I was waiting for something to happen. And then it did. I heard footsteps. Soft, deliberate footsteps, moving slowly from one end of the hallway to the other. My breath caught in my throat. I froze, straining to listen. The sound was faint, but it was unmistakable. It was as though someone was walking in the building, walking at the pace of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. My mind raced. I wasn't the only one in the building, of course, but the hallway was empty. I hadn't heard anyone approach, and the footsteps seemed to come from nowhere. I stood up, my feet moving instinctively toward the door. I didn't know why, but I had to check. I had to see who was out there. I opened the door slowly, cautiously, and peered down the hallway. It was empty. I stepped outside, the dim light in the hallway casting long shadows on the walls. I walked down a few paces, looking around. There was nothing, no sign of anyone. Just the lingering smell from earlier, faint but present. My nerves were on edge. I stepped back inside and locked the door behind me. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm myself, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But something about it felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed something, something I should have seen. The rest of the evening passed in an almost surreal fog. I kept hearing noises, small things, a creak from the ceiling, a distant thud in the walls, but nothing that I could point to directly. It was the kind of unease that sticks with you, that makes you question your own senses. Was I imagining it all? Or was something really happening? The following days didn't bring any answers. The strange footsteps stopped, and the smell faded, but the tension never did. Every time I walked down the hallway, I felt it's someone else's gaze on my back, a presence that wasn't supposed to be there. I couldn't escape it. I told myself I was being paranoid. That's what I kept telling myself. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right, and I couldn't stop thinking about the envelope. Those words, "I know your routine. I know where you live." I couldn't forget that whoever had sent it knew things about me. Too many things. And now, the small, unsettling signs were becoming harder to ignore. My life was beginning to feel like it was slipping away, like I wasn't in control anymore. It was as if whatever had started with that note was beginning to take shape in ways I couldn't understand. I tried to distract myself. I spent more time at work, staying late, hoping that the longer I was out of the apartment, the more I could push the fear aside. But even then, the strange feeling lingered. It was in the back of my mind, gnawing at me, making every noise feel like a warning. It wasn't long before the third strange event would unfold, one that would push me even further into the unknown. But that's a story for another time. The days that followed the strange encounter on Thursday night felt like a blur. Time seemed to move slower, each minute stretching out, each second thick with dread. The oddities began to escalate, gradually at first, but soon the frequency and intensity of the incidents became undeniable. It wasn't just a vague sense of discomfort anymore. Something was definitely wrong. And whatever it was, it seemed to be getting closer. The first thing that tipped me off was the noise. It wasn't a loud noise, not something that would make me immediately jump out of my skin. But it was enough to send a wave of unease through me every time I heard it. A tapping sound. Soft, rhythmic, almost like fingernails gently tapping on wood. It started faintly, around 2 o'clock. I would lie awake in bed, listening, my heart racing as the sound echoed through the silence of the apartment. It was never consistent, never predictable, but it was there. Sometimes it was close to the walls, other times it was further down the hallway, but it always seemed to be just out of reach. I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. I tried to tell myself that it was the pipes, that the building was old and full of creaks and groans. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I knew that something was wrong. I began to notice other small, unnerving changes in my apartment. The lights. At first, it was only one bulb, a flickering light in the kitchen that I thought might just need replacing. But then it started happening more often, lights dimming and brightening without reason, as though someone was playing with the switches. And it wasn't just the kitchen. It happened in the living room, the bathroom, and even in the hallway. Each time it happened, my stomach would tighten, and I would find myself staring at the light, waiting for it to stop or to do something more. I couldn't stop myself from checking the wiring, inspecting the bulbs, but they were all fine. It was like the apartment itself was alive, breathing and pulsing in ways I couldn't understand. The air felt thicker at night, heavier, almost suffocating. Every breath seemed labored, like the walls were closing in on me. I would lie in bed, wide awake, the darkness surrounding me like a weight. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. No matter where I went in the apartment, there was a presence, an invisible force that hovered just beyond my sight. And then there was the smell. I had hoped that the strange scent from the night I first noticed it was a one-time thing. But it returned. Not all the time, but often enough to make me question my sanity. The same metallic, sickly sweet smell would creep into the air, filling the room without any clear source. It was strongest in the hallway and near the bedroom. And the strangest part, it didn't go away. It lingered, like it was trapped in the very walls, woven into the fabric of the building itself. No matter how much I cleaned, no matter how many air fresheners I used, it never truly dissipated. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that it was just the old plumbing or the dust that accumulated in places I couldn't see. But every time I smelled it, my skin would crawl. I could feel my anxiety rising, my thoughts spiraling into darker places. It was clear now that something was happening, something beyond coincidence, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I began to search my apartment more thoroughly. I checked every corner, looked behind the furniture, and examined the floorboards. I moved the rug in the living room, checked the windows, peered into the closets. But nothing. There was no logical explanation. Everything seemed to be in its place. It was the same apartment I had always lived in, the same space I had known for months. But now, it felt different. It felt wrong. That's when I began to wonder if it was something outside the apartment, maybe someone else in the building. I had noticed the odd behavior of some of the neighbors, people who seemed to be more secretive, more detached. I thought about confronting them, asking if they'd noticed anything strange, but I hesitated. What could I say? Hey, have you noticed anything weird going on? Like, maybe someone is watching me, or there's a strange smell in the hall? I could already hear the laugh, the judgment in their voices. but I couldn't stop myself from trying to understand what was happening. I began keeping a journal of everything. I noticed the lights, the sounds, the smells. I documented the times when things felt off, when I felt that strange presence. I started to see patterns, small details that didn't quite add up. The noises always came at the same time around 2 o'clock, and they would last for exactly 10 minutes. The lights would flicker at the same moments, and the air in the apartment would feel thicker at certain hours. I tried to ignore it, but as the days passed, the tension mounted. It became unbearable. I had to find out what was happening. I started asking the neighbors about their experiences. It wasn't much, just casual conversation when we bumped into each other in the hallway or at the mailboxes. I tried to sound nonchalant, not wanting to seem like I was losing my grip. Most people just brushed me off, claiming they hadn't noticed anything unusual. But there was one conversation that stood out. I was talking to Mrs. Green, a woman in her late 60s who lived 2 floors above me. I had never paid much attention to her before, but that day, something about her made me curious. She was always quiet, never much of a talker, but this time, when I mentioned the odd noises, she stiffened. Her eyes flickered toward the floor, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "You're hearing it too, aren't you?" she asked, almost as if she had been waiting for me to say something. I thought I was the only one. Her words sent a chill down my spine. "What do you mean?" She glanced around the hallway, making sure no one was listening. "I've been living here for years, but it wasn't until recently that things started getting strange. The lights flicker. The air gets heavy. I hear things at night. Soft footsteps, scratching sounds. At first, I thought it was just the building settling, but now I'm not so sure." "Has anyone else said anything?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. She shook her head. "No, most people just stay to themselves. But I'm not the only one who's noticed something. I can feel it in the walls. Like something's watching." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. She had described the same things I had been feeling: the lights, the sounds, the sensation of being watched. I wasn't going crazy. Something was really happening. But what? I didn't get the chance to ask her more. She turned quickly and walked back to her apartment, leaving me standing there in the hallway, trying to process what she had just said. I had no answers, only more questions. The next night, the noises returned, but this time they were different. The tapping, the scratching, it was louder, more insistent. It was as if whatever had been moving through the apartment, through the walls, was now trying to make its presence known. I could feel it, the vibrations in the floor, the thrum in the air. It was getting closer. I could no longer ignore it. Whatever this was, it was real. And I had to figure out what was going on before it was too late. The tension that had been building for weeks reached its peak on a stormy night in mid-October. The air was thick with humidity, and the wind howled outside my windows, shaking the shutters like a hand trying to break through the glass. The darkened apartment felt like a living entity, and every creak of the floorboards, every rattle of the window panes, seemed to feed the growing anxiety I had been carrying for days. I couldn't sleep. The feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, was overwhelming. The air felt suffocating, oppressive. I kept hearing noises from deep within the walls, echoes of something alive. I had tried to ignore it. I had tried to push through, but every corner of the apartment seemed to be pulsating with something I couldn't understand. The noises had escalated, becoming louder, more frequent, more urgent. I knew that tonight, something would happen. It began around 2 o'clock, just as it always did. The tapping started first soft, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. It echoed from somewhere near the back of the apartment, faint but distinct. I tried to ignore it. I tried to tell myself it was just the pipes or the wind, but I knew better now. It wasn't the pipes. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. The lights flickered, and for a moment, everything went dark. My heart skipped a beat, and I sat up in bed, my eyes straining to adjust to the sudden darkness. The silence felt like a vacuum, pressing in on me from all sides. Then, just as quickly, the lights returned, but they weren't normal. They were dim, flickering erratically, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. I couldn't breathe. I didn't know what to do. The shadows twisted unnaturally on the walls, stretching and shifting in ways that defied logic. I could feel my pulse racing, my hands clammy. I had to get out of there. But before I could move, I heard it. A voice. Soft at first, a whisper, just below the threshold of my hearing. It was faint, but unmistakable. I held my breath, straining to catch the words. It wasn't clear at first, but as it came closer, the words became sharp, distinct, like a mantra being repeated over and over. I recognized it almost immediately. It was the same voice I had heard on the phone that first night, the one that had sent a chill down my spine. "You're not safe. You'll never be safe." The voice seemed to come from the walls, from the very air around me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I scrambled out of bed, my legs shaking beneath me. The voice continued, growing louder, more frantic. "You're not alone. You've never been alone." I backed into the corner of the room, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I had no idea what was happening, but I knew one thing: this wasn't just a bad dream. It was real, and whatever it was coming for me. The lights flickered again, and this time they went out for good. The apartment was plunged into complete darkness. I could feel the presence in the room with me, like something was moving, watching, circling. My senses were on high alert, every muscle tense, every sound amplified in the silence. Suddenly, there was a knock. A single, sharp rap on the door. I froze. No one ever knocked at my door at this hour. No one even knew I was here. I hadn't had visitors in days. My heart stopped. I couldn't breathe. The knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. I didn't know what to do. Should I answer it? Should I run? Was it real? Then the door creaked open. I didn't hear anyone enter, but the air shifted. The temperature dropped, and I could feel the cold creeping up my spine, like ice water trickling into my veins. I didn't dare turn around, but I could sense it. The presence, now standing in the doorway. I could feel it watching me. I didn't know how I knew, but I knew. The voice from the walls spoke again, now clearer than ever, as if it was right next to my ear. "It's too late. You've already let it in." My heart raced. I wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, paralyzed with fear. I felt the air grow heavier, more suffocating, as if the room itself was closing in on me. Then, in a blur of motion, the lights flashed back on. The apartment was bathed in an eerie, unnatural glow, and I saw it. Standing in the doorway, just beyond the threshold, was a figure. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. Its shape was wrong, shifting, as if it were made of shadows and smoke. Its eyes were hollow, empty voids that seemed to suck in the light around them. It didn't move, just stood there, staring at me. And as I looked closer, I realized that it wasn't just staring, it was watching me. It was studying me, as if it knew me, as if it had been waiting for this moment. The fear that gripped me was unlike anything I had ever felt before. It wasn't just terror, it was a deep, primal knowing that whatever this thing was, it had always been there, just beyond the edge of my awareness. It had been watching me, waiting for the right time to reveal itself. And now, that time had come. The room seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't understand. My breath came in ragged gasps as I tried to take a step backward, but my legs wouldn't move. I was trapped in place, unable to escape the figure in front of me. My mind was racing, my heart pounding in my chest, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. The figure took a step forward, and then another. It was getting closer. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But all I could do was stare, my body frozen with fear, as it moved toward me, closer and closer, its form becoming more solid, more defined. The air felt thick, suffocating, and the room seemed to shrink with each step it took. I could hear the faint whispering again, the same voice I'd heard before, only now it was louder, clearer. "You're not safe. You'll never be safe." And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stopped. It was right in front of me now, close enough that I could feel its presence, feel the cold radiating off of it. I could hear the sound of its breathing, slow and labored, as if it were struggling to exist in this space. For a moment, everything was still, and then, with a jolt, the figure reached out and touched my face. The moment it did, the entire room seemed to collapse in on itself. The walls twisted, the floor buckled, and the air turned to fire. I could feel the heat searing through my skin as the figure's touch burned into me. My vision blurred, and for a split second, I thought I was going to pass out. But then, everything went black. When I woke up, I was no longer in the apartment. The oppressive, suffocating darkness that had once clung to the walls was gone, replaced by an odd sense of stillness. My mind was foggy, my body aching, and I could still feel the burning sensation where the figure had touched me, though the pain had dulled to a constant throb. I was lying on the cold, hard floor of what seemed like an unfamiliar room. The air was thick with the scent of dampness, and I could hear the sound of my own breath in the quiet, each inhale sharp and shallow. I struggled to sit up, my hands shaking as I pushed myself to my feet, my head spinning. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw that I was no longer in the apartment I had called home. I wasn't even sure where I was. The room around me looked like an old, abandoned warehouse, rusted metal beams stretched overhead, and the floors were covered in dust and debris. A single flickering bulb hung from the ceiling, casting strange, warped shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The walls were lined with faded, peeling paint, and the windows were boarded up, allowing only a sliver of light to filter in. My heart raced as I stumbled to my feet, trying to make sense of what had happened, but there was no clear answer. The last thing I remembered was the touch the figure's cold, searing contact against my skin. It had felt like it was pulling me into some other place, a place where time and space no longer made sense. And now here I was, in this place, completely alone. Panic started to rise in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. I couldn't let the fear take over again, not after everything I had already been through. I had to figure out where I was and how to get back. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my phone in my pocket, praying that it hadn't been damaged during whatever had just happened. It was still there, but the screen was cracked, and when I turned it on, there was no signal, no service, no connection to the outside world. It was as if everything had been cut off, as if I was trapped in this strange, empty place with no way to reach out for help. I stood in the middle of the room, looking around in confusion, trying to make sense of what had happened. The last few weeks felt like a blur now, memories slipping through my fingers like sand. I couldn't remember how I had gotten here or how long I had been unconscious. Had it been days? Hours? I had no way of knowing. But one thing was certain. Whatever had happened to me was far from over. Suddenly, I heard a noise, a soft scuffling sound coming from the corner of the room. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned toward the sound, my body tensing, ready to run. The air seemed to grow colder, the shadows lengthening as if something unseen was drawing nearer. My eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of movement. And then I saw it. A figure, standing in the shadows, barely visible in the dim light. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. It wasn't the same figure from before, but it was something else, another presence, another entity, lurking just out of sight. It was tall and thin, its outline obscured by the darkness. Its face was a blur, shifting and changing with every blink, like a mirage that couldn't be fully grasped. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The terror that washed over me was overwhelming, paralyzing. This thing was different, but it felt just as dangerous as the one that had touched me. And I had no idea what it wanted or how to stop it. The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, its movements deliberate and almost predatory. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a wave of nausea sweep over me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Everything felt wrong. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen in place, trapped by whatever force this was. Then, just as I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, the figure stopped. It didn't move closer. It didn't speak. It just stood there, watching me, its presence pressing down on me like a weight. The silence stretched on, suffocating, until it felt like I was suffocating under the pressure of its gaze. And then, just like that, it was gone. The figure faded into the darkness, disappearing as if it had never been there at all. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifted, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence was deafening, and I felt utterly, completely alone. I took a tentative step forward, then another, my body trembling with every movement. I didn't know where I was or how to get out, but I knew one thing. I had to leave. I couldn't stay here, not with whatever that thing was lurking in the shadows. I didn't know what it wanted, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I moved toward the only exit I could see, an old, rusted door at the far end of the room. It was heavy, but I pushed against it with all my strength, my hands slick with sweat. It creaked open, revealing a long, dimly lit hallway stretching out before me. The air was cold and musty, and the walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, the paint long since faded and chipped. I stepped into the hallway, the floor creaking beneath my feet. My heart was racing, my pulse pounding in my ears, but I kept moving forward. I had no idea where this hallway led or what awaited me at the end, but I knew I couldn't stop now. Whatever was happening, whatever had brought me here, it wasn't over yet. I had to find a way to escape before it all consumed me. I walked for what felt like hours, my steps echoing off the walls, my thoughts racing. I passed empty rooms, some with broken windows, others with doors hanging ajar, but I didn't stop to investigate. Every instinct in my body told me to keep moving, to keep running. The fear inside me was all-consuming, like a fire that wouldn't be extinguished. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached the end of the hallway. There was another door, this one intact, its surface smooth and unmarked. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob, but then I pushed it open. On the other side was daylight. It was a strange, sickly light, almost unnatural, but it was daylight nonetheless. I stepped through the doorway, blinking against the brightness, and found myself outside. The air was crisp, the sky a pale gray, and the world around me was still silent, as if holding its breath. But even in that moment of seeming safety, I knew it wasn't over. I could feel the presence of something just out of reach, something watching, waiting. I wasn't sure if I would ever truly escape it, but I had to keep going. I didn't know where I was or how I had gotten here, but as I walked away from that place, I couldn't shake the feeling that I would never truly be free. The darkness that had followed me, the things that had haunted me in that apartment, had not disappeared. They were still out there, still waiting. And now, so was I. As I walked away from the place, the world outside felt surreal, almost detached from reality. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the cool air, feeling the sunlight on my face, but I couldn't shake the weight that had settled on my chest. The strange events, the figures, the oppressive feeling that had clawed at my very soul, everything that had happened still lingered, hanging in the air like a storm that had passed but left the clouds behind. I looked around, taking in the scenery for the first time since I had entered that forsaken place. The town seemed ordinary, quiet, peaceful even. People were going about their daily routines, completely unaware of the nightmare that had unfolded just beyond their reach. I felt disconnected from them, as though I no longer belonged to this world. Their lives seemed simple, untouched by the darkness I had encountered. I tried to convince myself that it was over. I had escaped. The eerie silence that had followed me, the way the shadows seemed to move in my peripheral vision, the way the air had felt thick with something unexplainable, it was all behind me. Or at least, that's what I told myself. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Not really. The figure, the one that had touched me, had never really left. I could still feel its cold presence, the searing touch that had burned into my skin. Sometimes, when the world was quiet, I could almost hear its whisper soft, like the brush of a cold wind, just out of reach. Other times, I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, heart pounding, with the feeling that something was standing at the edge of my bed, watching me. I tried to live a normal life again, to go back to my routine. But nothing felt the same. The walls of my apartment felt thinner, like they couldn't keep the world outside anymore. The air always felt colder, the shadows darker, no matter how many lights I turned on. My phone, damaged, but still usable, never showed any signs of life, like the signal had been cut off. I tried to reach out, to tell someone what had happened, but I couldn't find the words. Who could believe a story like mine? Who would understand that there are things in the world that don't belong, that defy explanation? I still kept the journal, the one that had arrived in the mail, the one that had started this whole thing. It sat on my desk, unopened. I could feel its weight, its pull, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. I wasn't sure I could handle it. Every time I looked at it, I remembered the last few pages, the parts that had felt like they were written for someone else, a warning, a message, maybe even a curse. I knew the journal was linked to everything that had happened, but I couldn't bring myself to confront it again. Not yet. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months. Slowly, I started to convince myself that I was safe, that the worst was behind me. I started leaving the apartment more often, running errands, going to work, trying to piece together a semblance of normalcy. But the nagging feeling never left. I could feel it in my gut. Something still wasn't right. And then, one day, something happened. I was sitting at my desk, going through emails when the air grew thick. The temperature dropped suddenly, and I felt it before I saw it, like the room had changed, like I was no longer alone. A shadow shifted across the room, moving just outside of my vision. I didn't need to turn around to know what it was. I didn't need to look to see the cold, dark shape that was waiting. The figure was back. It had followed me. It had never really gone away. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. All I could do was sit there, frozen in place, heart racing. I didn't know what it wanted anymore, but I had a feeling that whatever it was, it had come to finish what it started. It was waiting for me to acknowledge it, to confront it, but I couldn't. I was too scared. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know what was coming next. But as I sat there, trembling, I realized something. This wasn't just some random occurrence. This wasn't just a one-off nightmare or a strange twist of fate. The journal, the figure, the strange events, it was all part of something bigger. Something that had found me, that had marked me as its own. I had been chosen, for whatever reason, to be part of this horrifying reality. And no matter how far I ran, no matter how hard I tried to escape, it would always find me. It had already gotten inside my head, inside my life. As I finally turned to face the figure, the room seemed to bend, warp. The edges of reality shifted as if I was looking through a veil that was slowly tearing apart. The figure was still there, standing motionless in the corner. Its form had become clearer, sharper, but its features were still indistinct, an ever-changing blur that threatened to consume my thoughts. I stood up, feeling the cold sweat trickle down my back, the weight of the room pressing in on me. I couldn't run. I couldn't hide. I had to face it. I had to confront what had been haunting me for so long. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. It simply watched me, as though waiting for me to make the next move. And that was when I realized it. It wasn't here to hurt me, not in the way I had feared. It was here because it needed me. It was waiting for me to acknowledge it, to accept it, to finally understand that I was a part of something that had been set in motion long before I had even known it. This was my life now. This was my reality. And I had no choice but to accept it. The figure took one step forward, its shadow stretching across the room, pulling me in like a tidal wave. And as it reached out with its cold hand, I knew that there was no escaping it. I had been marked. I was part of the story now. It was an ordinary morning, well, at least, that's what I had convinced myself of at the time. I had just moved into this small, quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town with my partner. The house we found was quaint, one of those places that felt almost out of place in modern times, but in a charming way. The kind of home where you could hear the wind creaking through the floorboards at night, where the paint on the windowsills was chipped just enough to give it character. It was perfect for us, a little retreat from the chaos of city life. We'd been living here for about 2 weeks now, and everything was just as it should be. Mornings were simple coffee brewing in the kitchen, the soft hum of traffic from the main road a few blocks away, the birds singing outside our window. Nothing out of the ordinary. There was a certain comfort in the routine we had settled into, a kind of peace we had been craving. And life, for the most part, seemed to follow its usual rhythm. I remember it like it was yesterday. I had just finished a night shift and was looking forward to a few hours of rest. My partner had already gone out for their morning walk, so I took the opportunity to catch up on some much-needed sleep. The house was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves outside and the soft whir of the ceiling fan. It felt like the world had paused for just a moment, allowing me to breathe easy. But of course, things never stay peaceful for long. It was the next morning when I first noticed something strange. I had woken up to the usual chirping of birds and the soft light filtering through the curtains, but there was something different. The world felt slightly off kilter. My partner was still asleep, and I was groggily heading toward the kitchen to make my first cup of coffee when I noticed something unusual. It was there, on the windshield of our car, freshly drawn, perfectly formed. I stopped in my tracks, staring at it. It wasn't the typical dirt smudge or streak you'd expect from a night of rain. No, this was something deliberate, something personal. The words were scribbled across the glass in dark, jagged strokes. I know you're watching. I stood there, frozen, heart pounding in my chest. My first thought was that it was some kind of joke, a prank maybe. But who would do something like that? Who would write such a message on the windshield of our car, knowing we would see it? I quickly brushed off the feeling of unease that crept up my spine and chalked it up to nothing more than an odd coincidence. But that didn't explain how the message got there. The car had been parked under the same old tree, nothing different about it. The night had been calm, and no one had been near the vehicle. It didn't make sense. I grabbed a cloth and wiped the words away, trying to shake off the chill that had settled deep in my bones. It wasn't a big deal, I told myself. Just some harmless prank, maybe. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Later that day, after my partner had returned from their walk, I mentioned the message to them. They just laughed it off, brushing it aside with a quick joke about neighborhood kids. But I wasn't laughing. I could feel the weight of the words lingering in the air, something heavy and almost suffocating. Still, I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I didn't push it. That night, we went about our usual routine. Dinner, TV, a little chatting, and then bed. The world outside seemed to be going on as it always had, peaceful and quiet. But when I woke up the next morning, things had taken a strange turn. The message was back. This time, though, it was different. Instead of being written in large, obvious letters, it was scrawled in small, barely visible lines that only became clear in the morning light. They were harder to read, but still just as unsettling. I see you now. My heart dropped. I felt a cold sweat form on the back of my neck as I stared at the windshield. How was this possible? I had wiped the glass clean the day before. There was no way anyone could have snuck up during the night to leave another message. And yet, there it was, clear as day. My partner didn't notice it right away. They were still inside, getting ready for the day, oblivious to the unease that had taken root in my chest. But I couldn't ignore it. I knew this wasn't a coincidence anymore. There was something or someone watching us. The thought sent a shiver through me, and for the first time in weeks, I began to feel the tight grip of anxiety. I wasn't sure who or what was behind this, but I knew one thing for certain. I was no longer in control. Whoever or whatever it was had already made its presence known, and it wasn't going anywhere. The next few days passed in a blur, each morning starting with the same unease. Every time I stepped outside, my eyes would automatically dart to the car, scanning the windshield for any new messages. At first, I told myself I was overthinking it, that it was just some random prank or a figment of my imagination. But as the messages continued to appear, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something more sinister was going on. It was on the third morning when the incident occurred, something so subtle, so small, yet undeniably strange, that it pushed me closer to the edge of panic. I had been awake earlier than usual, a restless night leaving me with little sleep. The house was still dark, save for the faint light of the street lamps casting long shadows through the windows. I decided to take a walk around the block to clear my head before the day started. My partner was still asleep, the quiet hum of their breathing filling the room as I slipped out the front door. As I walked down the street, the air was heavy, as if the world was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but it wasn't like before. This time, it was different, more intense, as though eyes were lingering on me, unseen but undeniably present. I quickened my pace, my footsteps echoing down the empty road, but the sensation didn't go away. By the time I reached the corner, I could feel my heart racing in my chest, an overwhelming sense of unease pressing down on me. I turned around to head back home, but as I did, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. The car. I didn't have to look twice to know that something was off. The windshield, now completely clean the night before, was smeared with a thick, greasy film, as though someone had intentionally touched the glass from the inside. But here's the thing. No one had been inside the car. I'd made sure of it. I hadn't even touched the vehicle since the previous morning when I'd wiped the previous message away. And yet, there it was, a mess, a clear mark left behind. I cautiously approached the car, my breath catching in my throat as I leaned in for a closer look. The grease was thick, but there was something else, something even stranger. A fingerprint. Not just one, but several, scattered across the windshield, as if someone had been tracing shapes across the glass with their bare hands. They were long and fluid, curving and spiraling as though drawn in slow, deliberate movements. The marks were faint but distinct, and they weren't like anything I had ever seen before. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. This wasn't a prank. No child would have the patience or the motive to leave such a strange, unsettling mark behind. This wasn't something anyone could easily brush off as an accident. I stood there for a long moment, trying to make sense of it. The world seemed to hold still, the wind no longer rustling through the trees, the silence almost suffocating. Then, just as quickly as it came, the unease turned into a sense of dread. I had to tell my partner, but I couldn't explain it, not without sounding completely insane. With a deep breath, I made my way back inside the house, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. The moment I entered, my partner stirred from the couch, groggy and confused. They rubbed their eyes and blinked a few times, clearly not fully awake. "Hey, what's up?" they asked, their voice still thick with sleep. I hesitated for a moment, unsure how to even begin. "There's something on the car, some marks on the windshield. I don't know how they got there, but they're strange." At first, they just looked at me with a puzzled expression, clearly still half in dreamland. "What do you mean? You sure it's not just dirt or?" I cut them off. "It's not dirt. It looks like someone put their hand on the glass, but not just a smudge, a pattern. And it's not right." They stood up and walked over to the window, peering out at the car. A long pause stretched between us as they tried to make sense of what I had just said. Then they sighed and rubbed their face, clearly not convinced. "Maybe we should clean it off and just forget about it," they suggested. "It's probably nothing." But I couldn't let it go. I couldn't ignore that sense of something bigger, something darker, creeping in from the edges of my mind. This wasn't normal, and the feeling of being watched had only grown stronger. Later that day, as we sat down for lunch, I mentioned it again. What if someone's been watching us? My partner raised an eyebrow. "Who would do that?" "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I feel like someone's been coming around when we're not here. The marks on the windshield. They weren't there last night." They chuckled, but it wasn't a reassuring laugh. It was more nervous, as if they were trying to convince themselves that nothing was wrong. "You're overthinking it. We're probably just in our heads. You haven't been sleeping much, right?" That was true, but I wasn't sure sleep deprivation could explain away what was happening. I had seen the marks, I had felt the presence, and deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next few nights passed without any major incidents, but that didn't make the tension go away. Every time I stepped outside, my eyes would scan the car, looking for any sign of new markings or strange disturbances. My partner's casual dismissal of the situation did little to calm my growing sense of unease. It only made me feel more isolated in my fear. And then, on the fifth night, things escalated in a way I hadn't expected. I had gone out again to take a quick walk this time. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, but the street was empty. Still, I couldn't get rid of the sensation that something was wrong. As I passed the car, I noticed something even more disturbing. The windshield wasn't just dirty anymore. There, across the glass, was another message, but this time it wasn't just words. It was a symbol, a shape, as if drawn with purpose and intent. I didn't recognize it immediately, but it didn't matter. What mattered was how it made me feel. As I stared at the symbol, my blood ran cold. I had to get inside. I had to get away. But it wasn't just the symbol that terrified me. It was the fact that, this time, the marks were fresh, almost wet, as if someone had just touched the windshield moments before I arrived. There was no way it could have been there earlier. I didn't know who was doing this, or why, but one thing was clear. We were no longer alone. The days that followed the appearance of the strange symbol on the windshield were like a slow, creeping descent into madness. The world outside my door seemed unchanged, bright, sunny afternoons, the hum of traffic in the distance, the usual rhythm of life, but in my mind, everything had shifted. The feeling of being watched had not dissipated. If anything, it had grown stronger, more intense. Every time I left the house, my gaze instinctively turned to the car, checking for new marks, new signs. Each time, I felt that same dread creeping up on me, but I couldn't bring myself to tell my partner again. They'd already dismissed it as just my imagination, a product of overthinking. I wanted to believe them, to trust that I was simply being paranoid. But deep down, I knew something more sinister was at play. It started with small things, almost imperceptible at first. A flicker in the corner of my eye as I passed by the window, the faint sound of footsteps when no one was there. At first, I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks on me. But then it happened again and again, until the line between reality and paranoia began to blur. I woke up one morning to find the door to the garage slightly ajar. It wasn't open all the way, just a sliver, barely noticeable, but it sent a chill down my spine. I never left it that way. I could have sworn I had locked it the night before, yet here it was, inviting the cold morning air inside. I checked the car in the garage. Nothing had changed, at least not visibly. But the unease lingered, thick and palpable. My partner noticed my mood shifting. They had always been more grounded, more logical, but even they couldn't deny the odd things that had been happening. One night, while I was sitting in the living room, scrolling through my phone, they sat beside me, quiet for a moment before speaking up. "I don't think you're imagining this," they said slowly. "There's something strange going on, and I think we need to figure it out." I didn't know whether to be relieved or terrified that they were finally acknowledging what had been happening. There was a part of me that was still convinced it was all in my head, but another part of me, the part that couldn't ignore the creeping feeling of dread, knew better. We decided to start investigating, though I wasn't sure where to begin. Our first attempt was to examine the footage from our security cameras. The cameras were set up at the front and back of the house, a precaution we'd taken after a string of petty thefts in the neighborhood. We went through hours of footage, our eyes scanning every frame for any sign of movement, any figure lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing. Nothing except for one small detail. Every morning, the car's windshield was wiped clean. Not just cleaned white, as if someone had deliberately erased any evidence, any trace of what had been there the night before. The marks, the symbols, the fingerprints, all gone by morning. It was as though the car was trying to hide the truth, to bury whatever had been left on it. We both stared at the screen in silence, the tension thick in the air. It was clear that someone or something had been tampering with the car, and it wasn't just random. It was deliberate. But why? And how? We set out the next night to keep watch, though neither of us could shake the feeling that we were playing into something far bigger than we could handle. Armed with flashlights and a sense of unease, we camped out on the front porch, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever had been creeping around the car in the dead of night. Hours passed, and the air grew colder, the darkness pressing in around us. The house seemed to hold its breath, the usual nighttime sounds, distant dogs barking, the rustling of tree branches felt muted, as though they were far away. Our eyes darted toward the car every few minutes, but nothing stirred. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows across the driveway, and we both sat in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. Then it happened. A soft thud broke the silence, a sound so faint I almost didn't register it. It came from behind the car. I glanced over, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was no one there. Just the empty driveway, the dark outline of the car, the faint glow of the streetlights. My partner shifted next to me, their eyes wide with unease. "Did you hear that?" they whispered. I nodded, my voice barely audible. "I did." We waited, still as statues, listening. The air felt thicker now, heavier, as if the weight of something unseen was pressing in around us. Another thud came, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of something scratching against metal. My partner and I both leapt to our feet, our breath catching in our throats. We knew something or someone was outside. We grabbed our flashlights and rushed to the front yard, hearts racing, adrenaline pumping through our veins. The light flickered weakly as we shined it toward the driveway. My pulse quickened as the beam of light landed on the windshield of the car. The surface was smeared again, like the night before. But this time, the marks weren't just smudges. This time, they were more deliberate. Words had appeared written in the same greasy, unnatural way that had become familiar to us. "You're not safe." The letters were jagged, uneven, as if written in a hurry, smeared across the glass. My partner and I stared at it, our minds reeling. We both knew it wasn't some prank, not anymore. There was no way this was just some harmless joke. This was something else entirely, something far darker. We ran back inside, slamming the door behind us. My hands were shaking as I locked it, the sense of fear mounting with every passing second. My partner grabbed the phone, dialing the police, though deep down, we both knew it wasn't going to help. This wasn't something they could fix. The phone rang, the harsh tone of the dial tone echoing through the room. But before either of us could speak, the line went dead. The silence was deafening. The lights in the house flickered, casting strange shadows across the walls. I turned to my partner, fear and confusion etched across my face. "What's happening?" I whispered, my voice trembling. They didn't answer. Instead, they reached for the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer outside. I followed their gaze, my own heart pounding in my chest. Nothing was there, but something had changed. The car was gone. The next few hours were a blur of chaos and dread. As we stared out into the empty driveway, the stillness of the night seemed to mock us. The car was gone. Just like that, it had vanished. I could hardly comprehend what had just happened. How could it just disappear? No tire tracks, no signs of struggle, no evidence that it had even been moved. It was as if the vehicle had been swallowed up by the night, leaving only a hollow void where it once sat. I turned to my partner, their face pale, their eyes wide with fear. "What the hell is going on?" I managed to whisper, though my voice trembled. I didn't expect an answer. We were both thinking the same thing. This was no longer just a strange occurrence. This was real. And whatever was happening, it was bigger than us. Bigger than anything we could understand. The silence in the house was suffocating. The only sound was the hurried ticking of the clock on the wall, counting away the seconds. reminding us of the minutes slipping by in this nightmare. I glanced at the phone in my partner's hand. The screen was black. No signal. It was as if the entire world outside had disappeared. "We need to find it," I said, the urgency in my voice sharper than I felt. "We can't just sit here and do nothing. We have to find the car." My partner nodded, their lips pressed together in a thin line, the fear in their eyes undeniable. Where would it go? How could someone just take it without us hearing anything? I didn't have an answer. I didn't know how to explain any of this, but I knew we couldn't waste time. I grabbed my jacket and pulled it over my shoulders, the cold air biting into my skin as I stepped toward the door. We needed to move quickly before whatever had taken the car came back to finish what it had started. We ventured out into the night, the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement as we walked. My mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. But the harder I tried to reason with it, the more absurd it all seemed. We had just seen the car. It had been right there, parked in the driveway. But now it was gone. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of distant traffic and dogs barking absent. It was as though the world had gone still, frozen in time. We walked down the block, our footsteps the only noise breaking the silence. I kept glancing over my shoulder, the weight of being watched pressing against my chest. We rounded the corner onto the next street. Nothing. The streets were empty, not a soul in sight. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that we were walking into the unknown, and every instinct inside me screamed to turn back, to run, to leave this place behind. But I couldn't stop now. Not when we were this close to finding answers. Then, just as I was about to suggest we head back to the house, we saw it. The car. It was parked in the middle of the street, facing the opposite direction from where we had last seen it. Its headlights were off, but there was something strange about the way it stood there motionless, like it was waiting for us. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The dread that had been building inside me suddenly reached a peak, and I could feel it settling into my bones. "Is that?" My partner's voice trailed off, the words hanging in the air between us. "Yeah," I whispered. "That's our car." We approached it cautiously, our footsteps slow, deliberate. The car looked the same on the outside, no dents, no scratches, no signs of struggle. But the air around it felt wrong. Thick, charged with something I couldn't name. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the door handle, my hand trembling. The door opened easily, but when I stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. It was colder than it had been when we left the houses. My breath misted in the air, and the usual scent of the car leather and air freshener was gone. In its place was a metallic, almost sour odor that made my stomach turn. I scanned the interior quickly, my eyes landing on the dashboard. The windshield. The same symbol from before had appeared again, but this time it wasn't just one symbol. There were more, dozens of them. They were etched into the glass, their shapes twisting and overlapping, creating a pattern that made my skin crawl. "This isn't just a prank," my partner whispered from the doorway, their voice filled with dread. "This is something else." I couldn't speak. The words caught in my throat, my mind unable to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. How had this happened? The marks from the windshield, the strange symbols had appeared out of nowhere, and now they were carved into the glass, like some twisted message. Then, in the silence of the night, we heard it. A soft hum. A low, vibrating sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was faint at first, barely perceptible, but it grew louder with each passing second, filling the car with a strange, almost unbearable pressure. The lights on the dashboard flickered, casting eerie shadows across the seats. The hum intensified, now a steady thrum that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of my heartbeat. The temperature in the car dropped even further, and I could see my breath fogging up in front of me. "Get out. Now," my partner urged, their voice panicked. But I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, my eyes locked on the symbols. They were shifting, changing. The lines seemed to move, almost alive, as if the glass was no longer solid but fluid. I finally snapped out of my trance, my legs unsteady as I pulled myself out of the car. The hum was deafening now, vibrating through my entire body. My partner yanked me away, and we stumbled backward, away from the car, but the sound seemed to follow us. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the hum stopped. Everything was silent again. The car was still. The symbols on the windshield had stopped moving. But we both knew it wasn't over. The air felt heavier now, charged with an unspoken tension. I turned to my partner, my voice barely above a whisper. "We have to leave. We can't stay here. Whatever this is, it's not over." They nodded, fear clouding their features. "I don't know how much more of this I can take," they confessed. We ran back to the house, not looking back, not daring to see what might be following us. The front door slammed behind us, and we locked it without a word, collapsing against the walls, our bodies trembling with fear. But even as we sat there, gasping for breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us. Something had seen us. Something had marked us. And it wasn't finished with us yet. The night dragged on in an agonizingly slow procession. Every tick of the clock felt like it reverberated through my body, amplifying the dread that had taken root in my chest. We sat in the living room, trying to make sense of everything that had happened, but the more we talked, the less we understood. It was as if every word we spoke about the strange occurrences only deepened the mystery. At some point, we decided to call the police. It felt almost absurd, as though involving the authorities in something so otherworldly might be futile. Still, we had no answers, and the lingering terror of being unable to explain what was happening to us gnawed at my insides. The officer who arrived was as skeptical as we had feared. He listened to our story, brows furrowed, but the look in his eyes told us everything we needed to know. He thought we were either overreacting or delusional. He asked if we had been drinking or taking anything. We assured him we hadn't, and the skeptical look didn't leave his face. "We'll take a look around," he said with a hint of irritation, as though he was doing us a favor. But the truth was, no one could help us. There were no tangible clues, no real evidence of what we had experienced. The car, the symbols, the strange hum, none of it made sense. Hours passed. We sat in silence, both of us too exhausted and too terrified to sleep, our minds too overwhelmed with what had happened. The officer left after a while, muttering something about keeping an eye on things, but there was no real sense of resolution. In fact, the events that had unfolded felt more like the beginning of something that had no clear end. Still, we couldn't stay in that house any longer. The air in it felt oppressive now, thick with fear and uncertainty. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had taken our car, whatever had been leaving those cryptic symbols, was still out there, watching. The front door locked securely behind us, but it didn't feel like we were safe. "I can't do this anymore," my partner said quietly, staring into the distance, their voice almost lost in the stillness. "We need to get out of here, for good." I nodded, my heart heavy with the same sense of urgency. I wanted to leave, to run away from everything that had happened, to escape whatever unseen force had chosen us as its targets. But as we packed, I couldn't ignore the nagging thought that it wasn't over. That something more was waiting for us, something darker. The thought of abandoning everything, our home, Our lives felt like giving up. But how could we stay? How could we live in a place that had become a sanctuary for something far beyond our understanding? By the time we finished gathering the essentials, the sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the landscape. There was no sign of the car. No symbol marked the windshield. But the emptiness still lingered, and the dread that clung to the edges of my mind was unshakable. We drove away. I don't remember much of the trip, just the endless stretch of road ahead of us, the silence between us, and the growing sense that no matter how far we went, we would never truly escape. The air in the car felt heavy, as though the weight of what we had experienced was now part of us, following us no matter how far we ran. Days turned into weeks. We tried to resume our normal lives, but the unease never truly left. It hung in the corners of every room, every street we walked down. The mundane details of daily life couldn't mask the terror that had become our new reality. It wasn't the physical evidence of the strange occurrences that haunted us anymore. It was the feeling, the constant, nagging sense that we were still being watched. One night, as I sat alone in the dark, I finally gave in to the impulse I had been fighting for weeks. I opened my laptop and searched for everything I could find about the symbols. It took some time, but eventually I found something. The symbols on the windshield were not just random markings. They were ancient, dated to an era long before our time. They were symbols of summoning, of binding. Some texts described them as warnings, others as curses. My heart raced as I read through the descriptions, each one confirming the worst. What we had encountered was not a simple prank or an unfortunate set of coincidences. No, it was something far darker. The realization hit me like a physical blow. We had been marked. The symbols were more than just a message. They were a sigil, a tool for something far more sinister. Something had chosen us, and it was not finished with us yet. I couldn't bring myself to tell my partner. They had already been through so much, and I didn't want to be the one to add another layer of fear to their already fragile state. But as the days passed, the sense of being followed, of being hunted, grew more intense. It felt like there was no escape, no matter where we went, no matter how far we tried to run. It wasn't just the symbols on the windshield that haunted me. It was the faint sound of that hum, the eerie vibration that still seemed to echo in my mind. The low, vibrating pulse of something not of this world, something that had been inside the car with us. Something that might still be waiting for us to return. The car was gone. The symbols had faded, but the fear that something had been awakened remained. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the thought that we would never truly be free of it. We moved to another city. We changed our names. We tried to build new lives, to bury the past deep enough that it wouldn't find us again. But no matter how much time passed, I could never shake the feeling that something was out there, always just beyond the edge of my awareness. Waiting, watching. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I still hear that faint hum in the distance. It's been years now. Years since we left the old house. Years since the cryptic messages started appearing on the car's windshield. Time, for the most part, has dulled the edges of the terror, but it hasn't erased it. The past lingers in the shadows of my mind, always there, always waiting for a moment of weakness. The sounds, the symbols, the feeling of being watched, they're memories now, but they feel too real, too close to be just memories. Life has moved on. In many ways, I've moved on. We've both rebuilt to some extent, even though we still carry the weight of that night with us, heavy on our shoulders like an invisible burden. Every step forward seems haunted by the fact that there are things out there, things beyond our understanding, that are capable of reaching into our lives and twisting them in ways we can't even fathom. There's a part of me, a small part, that wonders if the past is really behind us. If the hum we heard that night was more than just a strange sound, if the symbols were more than just an eerie coincidence. It would be easy to say that it was all just a bad dream, that we let our imaginations get the best of us. But I know deep down that's not true. I know the feeling that gripped me in that house, the cold shiver that ran down my spine when I saw the markings, and the way my heart raced when I realized we were no longer in control. I've learned to live with it. That's the most honest thing I can say. I've learned to live with the knowledge that we aren't alone in this world. That there are forces out there, old and powerful, that exist just outside the realm of our understanding. And though I wish I could say we have answers, the truth is we don't. We never will. And maybe that's the hardest part, knowing that we'll never fully understand what happened to us. But perhaps there's something to be learned in that. Maybe the lesson isn't in finding the answers or uncovering the truth. Maybe it's about acceptance. Accepting that there are things we cannot explain, that there are mysteries that will never be solved. Accepting that sometimes we are powerless in the face of something far greater than ourselves. As I sit here now, in a different city, in a different life, the thoughts still haunt me. I've stopped looking over my shoulder as much, stopped checking the windows every time I hear a strange noise, but I still can't help myself. It's like a reflex, something embedded deep within me. I've come to terms with the fact that whatever it was, whatever chose us, is still out there. And it's always going to be out there, waiting. I can't help but wonder if it's the nature of these things, these mysteries, these forces to never truly be understood. Maybe the symbols on the windshield were just the beginning, a way of marking us. And maybe whatever lies behind them is still watching, still waiting for the right moment to make its next move. It's unsettling to think about, but I can't shake the feeling that it's the truth. The universe is far stranger than we can ever comprehend. In some ways, I feel like a part of me has been lost in that experience. A part of me that will never return, no matter how much time passes. Maybe that's the price of knowledge, of seeing something you weren't meant to see. Maybe it's the price of realizing that some things are far beyond our control. I still have the feeling sometimes, when I'm alone, that I'm being watched. It's not constant, but it comes in waves like a shadow moving just outside the corner of my eye. I try to push it away, to remind myself that it's just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know. The past isn't really gone. It's always with me. And as for the car, I don't know where it is now. I don't know if it was taken, abandoned, or left somewhere as part of the puzzle that we could never piece together. Sometimes I think about the car. I think about the strange, cryptic messages and the feeling that they weren't meant for us alone. That maybe we were just one of many. But that's just a thought, one that I can never prove. But it lingers, like everything else. I used to look for answers, to search for some kind of explanation. But after all these years, I've come to realize that not everything has an explanation. Not every mystery is meant to be solved. And some things, maybe the scariest things, are best left alone. So, as I wrap up this story, I leave it with you, unfinished, the way it will always be. I won't say that everything is okay now, because it's not. I won't say that I've found peace, because I haven't. But I've learned to live with it, to accept it as part of my story, whether I want it there or not. And maybe that's the scariest part of all, knowing that some things will never truly leave us. They'll stay in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to remind us that we are never alone. Even when we think we are.